Well, that light's pretty bright.
What are you talking about?
All right, so this thing's on.
Hey, Sasha. Good to meet you. Check and see if you're Here. How are you?
Welcome back from lunch. Our first panel discussion this afternoon will address incentives to invest in data security. And we are fortunate to have with us today 5 panelists who have thought a lot about this topic. First, my name is Elisa Gilson. I'm an attorney in the FTC's Division of Privacy and Identity Protection. Next to me is my co-moderator, Mike Legauer, who is an economist with the FTC's Bureau of Economics. Our first panelist is Lawrence A. Gordon, who is the EY Alumni Professor of Managerial Accounting and Information Assurance at the Robert H. Smith School of Business, University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Gordon is the author of the Gordon-Loeb model, which provides an economic framework for deriving an organization's level of cybersecurity investment, and he will be describing that model today. Next to him is Matthew P. Mccabe, the Senior Vice President and Assistant General Counsel on Cyber Policy for the insurance broking and risk management firm Marsh. Beside him is Tyler Moore, the Tandy Associate Professor of Cybersecurity at the University of Tulsa. And next to him is Sasha Romanowski, who is a policy researcher for RAND Corporation. And finally, we have Matthew Sharp, the Chief Information Security Officer at LogicWorks. Thank you all for being here. And for the audience, if you have questions during the discussion, please feel free to write them down on your question cards and flag Ryan or Mohammed, and they will collect your cards and bring them to the front. Now, this morning we heard some presentations on the impact of data breaches, and presenters discussed whether there's a market failure in security resulting from misaligned incentives, where companies guard data, but it's consumers who bear some or many of the costs of breaches of their personal information. To think through this problem of incentives, we'd like to take a look at current incentives to invest in security. So on this slide, there is a list of incentives. And so what I'd like to do, panelists, is to go down the panel and ask each of you, if you had to name the #1 incentive to invest in security, the most important incentive on this list, or not shown on this list, what would it be, and why do you think that's the case? And why don't we start at the very end of the panel with Matt.
Sure. Thanks, Elisa, and thanks to FTC for having us up. Well, I'm in the private sector and have served in a capacity in a number of different organizations, and also previously in 2 of the premier cybersecurity consulting firms in the country. The conversation, or my opinions, are probably biased by the opportunity to sit in closed door sessions with CISOs, where oftentimes I'm looking to learn from the guys who have the most, I'll say, street cred, if you will, the guys that are leading the largest programs in the country, and pretty predominantly what I've been coached to do, and what I've made a career of doing, is starting with value creation, so competitive advantage or customer demands. It seems to be the 2 that would be my preferred option. However, not all security investments are easily framed in those contexts.
And when you say competitive advantage, oftentimes we think of security in terms of a cost center. So how do you reconcile kind of that received wisdom with the notion of security as actually an advantage in the marketplace?
Sure. There's a number of firms, and it really depends on your business model, but for example, at my current employer, and these are my opinions, not necessarily representing the opinions of my employer, we have the opportunity to build a value-creating or revenue-generating service offering. So for example, we have built a data loss prevention service that actually expands revenues. But there are other companies many of them are our customers, where they're inspiring purchases in their organizations by differentiating on their ability to protect customer information. So, organizations out there that provide or support fintech offerings or health tech or reg tech, many of the technology-driven organizations that are looking to disrupt industries often have the ability to differentiate, and the way that one of the ways that they do that is by making sure that they can inspire confidence in their customers, be they consumers or B2B purchases, that they're going to value and treat the confidentiality of information as an important part of their business model.
That particularly makes sense where an obvious feature of the product is security. So if it's a cloud provider, or let's say it's a manufacturer of a home security system. So security is kind of at the fore of what consumers or customers are looking for. Do you think that that holds true where security is not such an obvious feature of the product, when a customer is buying shoes or a business customer is buying office furniture?
Yeah, I think that there's some validity to the emotional responses in management that happen in organizations that do sell things to consumers. For example, you mentioned shoes. In my background, I worked for a shoe manufacturer, so I have a little bit of insight there. And no executive team wants to be distracted by a major data breach, and no executive team wants to lose the opportunity to grow revenues because consumers don't believe that their information is protected. I think one of the panels earlier seems to indicate, at least from a market cap perspective, that that's not happening, and that consumers, in fact, don't behave consistent with their best interests. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the sentiment in management teams accurately reflects that reality.
Sasha?
Hello.
So going back to this slide, if you had to name the #1 incentive on or off this slide, what would it be?
I think it's a great slide, first of all, and I think the incentives that you've listed here are pretty super. And I think the exercise of ranking them is interesting, and I think as researchers, what we'd love most is be able to understand the marginal effectiveness of each one of these. I look at them, and for each one, I think we could have, I think we could spend the whole day discussing that. If we look at consumer trust and reputation, it's not really clear to me that there really is an effect of reputation. I'm not even really sure what reputation is, for example. I think what people mostly mean is just sales. And so if we think that, there's a loss of reputation, I think what most people interpret that as just sales. We heard from a panel this morning that there is a loss in stock market price because of data breaches. I think there's also a larger body of work that suggests that, in fact, there is no effect from data breaches. And if there is, it's a very short-term effect and then disappears after time. The story of ex-ante compliance and ex-post liability, I think, is fantastic. I think there's a whole world of a body of literature in law and economics that talks about the benefits and limitations of each one of these, and how they can be best applied, especially in situations like data breaches and privacy violations. So, for example, ex-ante compliance is useful when the inputs are strongly correlated with the outputs. So if we really believe that certain kinds of security controls will reduce the harms, will reduce data breaches, then compliance is something that we should try and promote more and more. Also useful when the injurers are known, when the injurers are unknown. If we don't really have a good handle on who is causing identity theft, where the breaches came from, yet there's some amount of consumer harm kind of underlaying the community, ex-ante compliance is good. Ex-post liability, very clear when the harms are very quantifiable, when there's property damage, when there's personal injury, and when the injurer is known. Then you can bring actions against the company and recover whatever losses. The ex-ante compliance, better when the state has more information about the kinds of harm relative to the firms. If the firms themselves don't really collect information about which consumers or employees are harmed in different kinds of ways, but the state, so for example, an FTC or a regulator, has broader information about an overall population that suffers some kinds of harm, ex-ante compliance can be very useful. If the harms occur long after the accident has occurred, for example, if that continuity, if that correlation is very weak somehow, compliance can be very good. I'll say that, however, so all of that paints a picture of how compliance could be very useful in the case of data breaches and privacy violations. On the other hand, it still seems to be a case that we're not very good. We haven't gotten very good at understanding what these harms really are. We heard earlier today losses in the hundreds of dollars for consumers, average losses. Still seems to be true that most people don't lose very much at all, if anything. And it's really kind of a failure on our part, on the information security industry, that we are not very good at understanding what kinds of security controls really are effective. I think everyone in this room, and certainly experts, we could all produce a list of technologies, of procedures that would help in some kind of way, two-factor authentication, firewalls, intrusion detection, whatever, but nobody is really able to tell us which ones are more effective and by how much. We just aren't there yet. We just don't have the maturity as an industry. Consumer demand or customer demand for privacy and security. So this is a story of whether or not firms compete on privacy. And I think in one of the previous panels, there was a few weeks ago, there was discussion of whether or not firms actually compete on privacy, on security. And there was the argument that, oh, well, yes, they do, of course, because look at all the money that firms have invested in different kinds of features. I'm not really sure that's evidence that there is a demand for privacy. At best, what we can do is highlight search engines like DuckDuckGo and talk about different kinds of privacy-enhancing technologies that exist in the marketplace. And that's nice, and they're there, and they work, but they haven't really reached that kind of market penetration, right? They're certainly not competing with Google. They're certainly not competing with Bing. And so I'm not really convinced that there is actually customer demand for privacy. I think if there was, we wouldn't be trying so hard to find it. Insurance is a great field, and I think a number of us could talk all day on the benefits of insurance. I think that does provide, or at least in theory should provide, incentive for firms. They can enjoy lower premiums, they can enjoy broader coverage, they can enjoy fewer exclusions in their policies if they've adopted certain kinds of security controls. Again, I'll point out we don't really know what those security controls should be. But in theory, it should work and it should provide incentives. And that could be a win-win-win for everyone. Firms are lower risk, insurance companies are more profitable, and overall social welfare is increased from fewer breaches. So back to your question, you asked me, which one of these is, could be the most powerful. I don't really have an answer. I haven't studied that. What I can say is that each one of these offers the potential for creating incentives, but none of these alone, certainly from my mind, really sticks out as a major force driving firms.
Sasha, so you said something that I thought was interesting about reputation, and essentially that it, in your perspective, it just collapses all down to sales, essentially, right? That this is, the business's reputation in the minds of consumers. But you could also think of individual executives' reputation, right? So some individual executive has domain over the cybersecurity posture of a firm. There's been some high-profile incidents recently where executives lost their job or had their communications exposed as a result of a data breach. Can you talk a little bit about the extent to which concern for personal reputation might drive security? So we have all this research that says maybe business reputation doesn't matter so much, but if an individual executive's job is on the line, could that make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. It could. I think that's a knowable thing. I would think what you could do is just ask a bunch of CISOs really what drives their incentives, right? That would be one way, and I think we'll get at some of this, and Tyler's done some great work on that too. It is also true that there aren't that many situations where executives have lost their jobs because of this. Certainly in the Sony case, in the Equifax, and the Target, there have been, right, some embarrassment and some layoffs because of that. Although I think in some of those cases, they did enjoy a bit of a golden parachute from leaving afterwards. So it is possible that the threat of personal reputation could drive better behavior. I'm not sure I would be the best one to answer whether or not how much that affects their decision making. I think Tyler would be better at answering that.
And Tyler?
Okay, so hi. So I think Sasha's right in that each of these incentives you list, I think, have an impact. If I were to pick one, I would point immediately to compliance as being the single biggest driver, certainly of investment in security. And when we talk to CISOs, they almost grit their teeth when they say it, but it's, they know that a compliance-driven mindset to security doesn't lead to the best security plan and posture, but they also know that an argument for compliance is the most effective in getting the budgets that's required. It sets the floor for what you have to do. And so much of what we do in cybersecurity and cybersecurity plans result from compliance demands, whether it's Sarbanes-Oxley, which shouldn't even necessarily have anything to do with cybersecurity, but it has driven an entire emphasis on security among publicly traded firms, or to more sector-specific compliance rules. So that, to me, seems to be the strongest incentive to invest in cybersecurity writ large for companies. It's a fairly imprecise instrument, and it tends to set a floor and not a ceiling in terms of what should be achieved. So there are definite downsides, but it does seem to be effective. A comment about all of these incentives is that I do think they all have an impact. I think the real question is whether or not these incentives on their own are sufficient, and I would argue that they are not taken as a whole because of the presence of market failures, and in particular, two market failures: the presence of negative externalities of cybersecurity incidents and breaches. So long as the harms resulting from a breach go beyond the affected organization who makes the security investment decision, they will tend to invest less in security than would be socially optimal. So take the example of Equifax. The data breach happened. It was bad for their company. Their C-suite got replaced. And yet the harms to consumers, to broader society, to financial institutions is much, much greater than what Equifax itself on its own experienced when you view it collectively. There's also information asymmetries in that we don't actually have a good sense often of what an effective investment is, sort of following on from Sasha's point about, we have recommendations on different investments to make, but we don't know how effective one particular control is or not. We also don't know often what the true magnitudes of certain kinds of risks are. And that, in a certain sense, data breaches is kind of a positive exception to that, because we have had more than a decade's worth of data breach requirements in force. We now know arguably more about the prevalence of data breaches than just about any other cybersecurity threat. And so that has certainly, I think, influenced boards and the sort of governance of companies to focus on preventing data breaches, because it has become so visible as a result of data breaches. So we see a lot more attention being paid to data breaches than we might see being paid to other forms of cybersecurity risks. So just the obligation to disclose, I think, serves as an incentive to make some investment.
Matt?
So I would opt for the top incentive to be reputation, but I would redefine it in a way that it's really reputation to your stakeholders. I think that's how, certainly for public companies, they think of it to their board and ultimately to their shareholders. I mean, if you think about it, you have an organization that is a viable concern, hopefully a highly successful organization, and you have certain risks that you deal with every day. Some of it is financial risk, and you have the opportunity to plan for that appropriately. Some of it might be an ethics risk, and you have the opportunity to put in a compliance regime and to have governance over that to monitor it. But cyber risk for many of these companies is kind of that unknown risk that can just take your legs out from under you. And I would say that all these other components actually feed into the companies and the C-suite's ability to maintain reputation. What is our relationship with our customers? Are we meeting our compliance regimes? Am I limiting my exposure to large liability? Am I reducing costs? These are the items that all senior officers go through every day in order to maximize performance. So I think from a corporate standpoint, at least, reputation is the ultimate concern.
Larry?
Okay, so I would say I want to rename cost reduction to cost savings. I would say cost reduction or cost savings, because you got to think in terms of cost being implicit and explicit costs. So there are explicit costs of detecting and correcting. There are implicit costs. The implicit costs pick up ex-ante compliance, reputation effect, and ex-post liability. Those are costs to a company, okay, if they have a big breach or potential costs. So really, you could wrap up 3 or 4 of those right into the cost savings notion. So companies look at it from that point of view. But I think it was Tyler who mentioned one of the real issues is that a lot of the big costs are what we call implicit costs, the cost of, affected with reputation, the way we look at that through stock market returns. Unfortunately, these costs tend to be transitory, and by that I mean they're not permanent. They're temporary. Stock prices drop down. Look at the big breaches we had. Take a look at Targets, for example. The stock dropped down for a few weeks, and then it comes back. But on the other hand, part of those costs is that there are executives who lose their jobs. The CEO lost his job. The CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, she decided 1 month after the breach that it was time to retire, that she was planning on it anyway. And we see that quite often. Actually, a lot of the security officers are the ones who bear the brunt. So what we have is an agency problem. Well, at least from my interaction with security officers, many of them, they look at this and say, look, we need more security because I'm the one who pays the price. And from the chief financial officer's point of view, he or she looks at it from cost-benefit basis. So, what are the benefits, what's the cost? And if the benefits aren't greater than the cost, so we take a hit. It's an operating cost. So I would say cost reduction, because to me, cost reduction includes compliance. If you don't comply, you got a significant cost. Reputation effect, if you have a big breach, that's a cost to your company. Ex-post liability is clearly a serious cost. And so you could wrap up many of these into cost reduction. On the other hand, I would also say that all of these things are important. So it's not like one doesn't count. But to me, when companies look at, corporations that I deal with, when they look at security, they're thinking in terms of potential costs. And they're thinking in terms of there's a cost to a reputation if they have a big breach. There's a cost to if you have a big lawsuit and you lose. There's a cost to not complying. There's a cost to detecting and correcting breaches. So all these things I'd put into costs.
So can I just comment on that description? And, this is perhaps a little oversensitivity, but to kind of back up some of our portfolio of clients and even our own company, I think it's very rare that you have a CFO or treasurer who says, look, you just analyze the costs, and if we have to take a hit, we take a hit. I just don't think that that's how companies think about this problem. I think what they do, and to go off of Sasha's comment, the hard part of this is the calculus of what's the overall efficacy
of these protective measures. So there was a great post on a White House blog several years ago about a CISO complaining to Michael Daniel that, look, I spend millions for security that's regularly defeated by a $500 rented piece of malware. What is my extra investment in security going to yield? And if you can't put a number on that, I just don't want to keep throwing dollars into a pit and suffer a continuum of breaches anyway. So I think actually what you're seeing is that there's acceptance within a lot of industries that breaches are going to happen and that you're never going to be able to have a 100% solution. So you're going to have to get to a high level of security but prepare for breaches anyway, and it becomes more of a risk management and a governance conversation.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what Matt said. I didn't mean to be cavalier about it, but take a look at the NIST 1.1 version. They explicitly say the tier you want to be on is a cost-benefit decision. That's what I meant. It's overall, you have to look at it from that point of view. So if you look at cybersecurity risk management, you need to look at it from a cost-benefit point of view. Even NIST puts it into their cybersecurity framework. And NIST, when you talk about compliance, the NIST framework, ever since our current president said that all government agencies have to be at least consistent with that, that's been one of the biggest compliance issues I see, to really get firms to look at their cybersecurity in a more serious way than they may have done in the past. But I agree. I didn't mean to be, they're not cavalier about it. I meant that they look at this as, I can't have 100% security, so the question is how much do I invest? Right.
So let me add one thing though that I think gets lost in the discussion that I don't think is inconsistent with what both of you have said, but that if we were talking about firms and enterprises and enterprise level risk management, cyber will be one of the risks that they have to manage. And so yes, it becomes a cost benefit decision, and I think that's appropriate to the extent that we can reasonably quantify costs and benefits, and I'm not convinced that we need to. Certainly as researchers anyway, we really want data, and we love data, we love analyzing data. That's kind of the fuel by which we go. But in this case, it's not clear to me that more numbers actually get us further ahead. But the real point is that if we want to manage cyber, just like any other kind of enterprise risk, I think what we need to do is assume that if an appropriate assessment is done and it turns out that cyber risks don't pose that great of a threat to us, that they will be deprioritized, that the investments will be deprioritized. And I think we should accept that. That would be appropriate for a firm to do. So when we speak of incentives, what doesn't appear here, so these are all incentives for firms to invest in cybersecurity. They don't really ask the question of how should firms prioritize cyber relative to all of the other risks they face, tax and finance, employment, supply chain, competition, the list goes on and on. So one useful exercise, I think, will be to understand how cyber relates in terms of risks to these other areas. And again, if it's true that cyber just doesn't present itself as a great risk, then it should be appropriately deprioritized.
Can I answer? I agree with what Sasha said, but I'd even go further and say that from an investment point of view, investments in cyber is just one of the major investments companies make. And companies, unless they're in business to sell cybersecurity services, they can't put all the money into cyber. So they have to look at this as they look at other investments. And whether we like it or not, most major corporations use NPV models. They know they're not precise. It's a framework. It's a framework that they go through a process. And over time, you assume that the results from that process will be beneficial, that you're going to make better decisions by following a set process. And I think when it comes to cyber investments, it's the same idea. Cyber investments are competing with all other investments. CFOs, I know lots of CFOs, and they tell me everyone comes in and wants more money. They want a new product line. They want to do some new building, new equipment. So cyber investments are competing with other investments. And once you realize that, it's a resource allocation decision in firms. They can't, but, for example, Target was spending a ton on cyber. It wasn't like they were not spending money on it. Okay, their breach was due to outsourcing a little piece of their work. So I agree with what Sasha, was saying that, but I would just say it's more than just the incentives. It's across the whole level of investments, and that's the real issue. So you need a process, and the process has to be somehow consistent with the other investment decisions, because eventually someone asks you, why should I give you more money rather than putting it over here?
So Larry, I think Tyler brought up the point. It's about who bears the brunt of the outcome, the benefit of the outcome. And I think if we're thinking about this in the context of enforcement, which I think is a little bit the point, and thinking about if there is in fact an agency problem, meaning we make an investment that's appropriate for my firm but doesn't necessarily consider all of the externalities, then there's that true risk of market failure. And I think that's the piece that, while I agree there's a cost-benefit analysis and every CEO, CFO, CISO is balancing the allocation of scarce resources fundamentally, the broader question is how do we effectively influence that for the protection of consumers? And I think we've circled around compliance. Tyler, your research talks a lot about the compliance story, and I think in many cases it has helped. Related to Larry, some of your research, the first dollar you invest in security is going to be much more effective than the 10th dollar you invest, meaning there are diminishing returns. And I think, Larry, your approach puts a cap on what is an appropriate ceiling, and so then compliance drives the floor, and somewhere in between I'm stuck negotiating with the various executives. And I think what we find that's maybe not represented here, but all too true, is there's an element of storytelling and charisma that CISOs bear the brunt of carrying in order to get the adequate budgets. And if I can have an appealing story, it sort of relates back to my original commentary, if I sit in front of my CFO and I can expand revenues, I get money.
Right.
And if I sit in front of that same executive team and I tell a story of the world is ending and no amount of investment will ever get me past the it's not if but when, then I get money once, and that's what happened in 2014 for a lot of CISOs, and then the money dried up by 2016, right?
Everything you said, I agree 100%. So what I always talk about is revenue-generating projects versus cost-savings projects. And what Matt just said is exactly that point. So the example I always give is something like, if you come and ask for a $10 million investment in a new product line that's going to generate $20 million in additional revenue. So let's just say the net benefit there would be the 20 minus the 10, or 10 million, the bottom line goes up by 10 million, okay? You're much better off asking for that than if someone comes along like Matt and says, I want a $10 million investment in a network security, and I'm going to save you $20 million in costs, right? But you don't show any revenue growth. And the name of the game for most senior executives, especially if they're on stock options, is revenue growth, because the stock market, there's lots of evidence, stock market moves with revenue growth. So what Matt just said, I would say, can you come to my class? I talk about this in class all the time, exactly what you just said. And I actually bring in people like yourself, Chief Information Security Officers, to give examples of just what you said. So thank you. I mean, that's a great testimonial.
To Larry's class.
Okay. Let the panel carry on, maybe.
So let's move now to talk about each of the incentives that's listed here. And so the first is customer trust, and we have a question from the audience about why we did not include customer welfare or customer well-being on this list of incentives. So to what extent do you think that customer welfare or well-being collapses into trust? And how much does trust matter? Does it matter if consumers begin to view a certain firm as no longer trustworthy on security, or do the number of breaches we've seen and the fact that people keep shopping at these places show that maybe trust doesn't matter that much. On the other hand, does trust matter particularly in certain areas? So maybe for companies that have children's information, financial information, health information, certain forms of sensitive data. Where does trust matter, if at all?
I can offer the anecdotal evidence that comes out of CISO roundtable community discussions. Certainly, for the discussions that we have inside of the roundtables, the dialogue is basically customers have to trust in order for sales to go up, right? So I think we end up equating all of those things in a different way, whether it's competitive advantage or reputation or customer trust. At the end of the day, the protecting customers is important, but I think earlier in the session previously, we've seen that consumers don't necessarily behave congruent with their own best interests. For example, the comment about 10% of Gmail users having multi-factor enabled would lead to consumers just don't behave in a way that would be in their best interest, because the email account is actually how you can reset every other password that they have access to.
So just the question about consumer welfare. I mean, I think consumer welfare is what, when you're thinking about, overall what the social outcome social welfare should be, then obviously you need to consider consumer welfare. When you're thinking about firms and what's going to drive their incentives to invest, their perspective is different. Their perspective is on what maximizes the firm's revenue. If they're in a consumer-facing industry where, it's important that they respect privacy, it's important that they gain the trust of their customers, then they will act accordingly. But I think it's very much not the case across the board. You look at the example of Equifax, which is, that trust should be important to their business, but it was actually incidental, and to a certain degree, the trust that they needed to engender is with their customers, which weren't the people whose data was lost. So, I think firms are going to, in general, look at an incentive which is maximizing their own interests, which may or may not align with consumer welfare.
I want to jump in and move to discussion about compliance and liability. I think it's been brought up by most of you, either explicitly or implicitly, that you think that compliance and liability are big factors in cybersecurity investments. So the question I want to pose to the panel is, do these compliance considerations actually encourage more marginal investment, or do they just sort of reallocate the investment that's already going to happen? In a sense, is there a hard budget constraint on what you can spend, and compliance considerations direct where it goes, or do compliance considerations actually spur additional investment?
Yes, I think it's both. It depends on the firm, in that there are some firms who are maybe a bit more sophisticated and are thinking beyond just compliance, who have allocated their budget, and then they realize that there's a significant chunk of it that just has to be allocated to dealing with compliance considerations. Yep. And that's the ideal, probably. But then there are other firms who otherwise would select below the floor, and then the compliance requirements end up setting the floor, and that entirely directs what they need to spend their money on.
I think if they have a budget constraint and they can't go over it, then they're reallocating. So, and if they can get additional funds and they're not at their constraint, then it's a question of trying to figure out the sort of best allocation. So it's a combination. It really does depend on exactly, what Michael said was, do they have a budget constraint, right? And also the other point I would make is, how are they allocating the funds currently? Are they compliance might force them to reassess their allocation process, and maybe they weren't at the best position from their point of view. They may reallocate it. So it's those two factors. Where are you in terms of the allocation of your resources, and what kind of budget constraint do you have?
Yeah, I would
Thinking about compliance and liability together, how is investment to ward off liability different from investing to meet compliance obligations?
At the most basic level, what their difference is that it's the ex ante versus ex post, in the sense that, you have a compliance rule in place because you want the investment to be made to prevent the harm from ever being realized in the first place, right? And so if the harm is so great that it cannot be easily reversed or mitigated, then you focus on ex-ante compliance. If the harms aren't so great, then you can just assign liability and deal with the fallout after the fact. When you think about breaches of personal information or any breach of confidential information, one of the big challenges is as soon as you have this breach of confidentiality, there's no going back, right? So as soon, when all of the Social Security numbers get disclosed from a large data breach, there's no way to undo that breach of confidentiality. And so it's a one-way action. And so when you have situations like that where the bad event has sufficient costs and cannot be reversed, then the emphasis should be on compliance. If in fact the harms aren't so great, or they can more easily be reversed, their effects, then you can push towards liability.
So I'd love to respond to that. The dialogue in the cybersecurity community today has largely been we've invested, perhaps over-invested in preventative controls in the network. And the reality is the conversations that are happening in boardrooms are about cyber resilience, acknowledging the if, but not if, but when sort of paradigm of thinking. And I think you'll hear from some other very innovative firms that are starting to drive stronger opportunities to have more holistic prevention. But when you look at the, Sasha, I think it was you that made a comment earlier, when we're making decisions on where to invest money, that we don't necessarily know what the best places to place those bets are as CISOs. And I think there's some nuance that we can pull out of that a little bit further and say, I think just about everybody that you would talk to in the security community would say we need to have multi-factor, we need to have patching, we need to have configuration management. But every FBI and secret security briefing that you go to talks about how the overwhelming evidence is that the patching is not functional and the configuration management is not working. And so I think the question of we don't know what to invest in is not the real issue. It's we don't know how to make the organizational or process changes effectively in order to achieve the ultimate outcomes that we're after. And so I think there's nuance in the data that you're interpreting has a different nuanced outcome to consider.
I mean, I see those as the same thing, right? The point is we don't really know what's best. We don't know where to spend our first dollar. We have a bucket of technologies, of processes, of things we think we should do. They probably all work to some extent, but we don't know where to start investing in order to exhaust our budget.
And to your point about misconfigurations, and we spend all this money on controls, but we don't have the people in place to be able to adequately use them. I think that's, at a high level, is still an issue of budget, right? Because you need to be able to, you can reallocate your resources into people who can be trained to be able to effectively use the controls that you have deployed. And there is definitely a challenge there because of workforce limitations and just the behavioral preference to buy another service or another tool rather than to adequately use the tool you have.
Yeah, I think the hamster on a wheel starts to become the issue. We get an unlimited number of vulnerabilities coming from the hundreds of thousands of users and different applications. And so no matter how good we do, there will always be a percentage of users that click on phishing. There will always be a percentage of applications that will not be patched. And so the dialogue, and I think Matt probably can speak about this a little bit further, is shifted to we're going to accept that some percentage of this can't be mitigated, and we need to start to actively manage the downside impact through cyber resilience investments.
I mean, for what it's worth, I really like that point. I think, and again, Matt can speak of the insurance policies, right? So what you see in the applications and the rate schedules that carriers use is to ask a bunch of questions related to technical issues. There's some process stuff in there, But again, we don't really know, right? We're asking a battery of questions that we think are correlated with better security posture, but we don't have any evidence to demonstrate which ones, which technologies are better and even which questions to ask. And I think I'm of the mind now that those nuances don't really matter. And what does matter is a story of resilience and a maturity of processes. And I think the better we are able to assess maturity of processes, the more quickly we'll get at an understanding of better security posture versus weaker security posture. And resilience is tied into that. And so, I mean, I reject the claim earlier that there are two kinds of companies, those that have suffered a breach, those who don't know it. I think that's a silly comment, right? It's a marketing comment. It's just like, it just can't factually be true. But there is something to the point of, look, we should accept that we will be breached. And even if that doesn't happen, we should prepare for it. And so what that means is that you establish a level of maturity of processes in order to maintain resilience. We accept that we start off with a level of output of our firm here, that we become resilient to absorb some percentage of that attack, of that outage, and that we develop processes to return to that 100% output level as quickly as possible. This is this resilience triangle that people talk about. And I think that's a smart way. I can't prove to you, but I believe that's a smart way of reducing the cost and addressing the problem.
So I want to move on because we have, since we have Matthew Mccabe here and all this talk about resilience and risk management, I think we would be remiss if we didn't ask Matthew to talk a little bit about cyber insurance and explain how cyber insurers make decisions about what policies are appropriate for which companies.
Sure. And I actually think it moves on just as a perfect segue from what we are talking about, because I think that mindset that you're talking about is what industry currently has. I mean, certainly when we're going through an insurance process, the process is not a checklist of what technologies do you have and did you get 7 out of 10 and therefore you scored a 70. Quite frankly, the process is, you know, it might start with a question of how much data are you holding, what type of data you're holding, and what do you do to limit your sensitive data? And then there's a discussion back of what that process is, of how you appreciate what your assets are. Do you really need all this data, or do you have a data limitation policy? So cyber insurance is all about the maturity of organizations. And I mean, I guess I would reject the notion that it's without basis of how to assess posture of a company. It is definitely not an exact science, but all reports are that cyber insurance industry is profitable, and therefore one could say that economically determined to be doing a good job for assessing security. With, you know, of course there are breaches and there are claims and there are exceptions that pop up, but overall in the macro standard doing very well. So there's, I would say, to really simplify the product of cyber insurance, and maybe just to back up a step, it's different from having a cyber-related peril than having cyber insurance. Cyber insurance is a very specific product. Cyber-related peril means that I was able to hack into an industrial control system, get something to blow up, and as a result, there's a property claim or there's a liability claim. That's not cyber insurance. That's on more traditional lines, like property or casualty. For cyber insurance, you're looking at a bucket of 3 things. I've had a cyber incident, and I have to pay out of my pocket to respond to that incident somehow, whether in the data breach context, that's providing notice and providing credit monitoring or credit restoration, or whether that's dealing with a ransomware event and restoring data, or replicating the actual servers or devices that have become corrupted, what's often called a bricking event. Number 2 would be the liability angle. And I think that there's large amount of incentive that can be gained out of liability. We had the conversation between compliance and liability. I would look at compliance as a standard of liability, but if you can actually work with liability and find ways to cap liability by going above layers of compliance, then you have very powerful incentive for the private sector. And then the third bucket for cyber insurance really deals with the continuing operation of a company, what we would call business interruption. So if you're like in a NotPetya event, if your company's been taken down and disabled, whatever extra expense you might have from that and whatever income that you've lost can be covered by the insurance. But I will say for the product itself, as cyber risk has grown, the product and what it covers expands more and more every day. And I think that it's become one, look, the overall market for protective technologies in the United States alone is in the neighborhood of $115 billion, according to Gartner Research. The overall amount of cyber insurance global premium written, according to Betterly, is in the neighborhood of $5 billion. So are those exact numbers? No, but they can give you a pretty good estimate of where we are from how much we've invested in protective security to coming on the scale of we're realizing it's really a management process. We're never going to be able to protect everything. So how resilient are organizations responding to cyber threats and recovering from them? And if you look at our industry, they've started to turn to the risk transfer part, where we've, the take-up of cyber insurance has been in the neighborhood of 20 to 30% for 4 or 5 years now.
So how should we think about cyber insurance? Is it properly thought of as an incentive to have better security because companies want better premiums and coverage, or should we think of it more in terms of it's simply a risk transfer mechanism? And is there a moral hazard problem with cyber insurance?
So in reverse order, I would say no, there's not a moral hazard problem, because I don't think that companies are spending on insurance in order to accept the fact that they have known defects. I think what they're doing is realizing that they can't spend their way out of this problem, and they're taking it on as another risk management strategy. When the NIST framework was being developed, part of President Obama's executive order required 3 different agencies, Commerce, Treasury, and the Department of Homeland Security, to publish reports on incentives, and cyber insurance was the only one common to all 3. And that seems like a very odd thing because it's an expenditure, and you don't really view an expenditure as something to incentivize better controls. But I think in the mature sense, you're thinking, look, if I'm going to have cyber insurance as part of my overall risk management strategy, then my ability to perform good security is going to be realized on the insurance side as well, with declining premiums and with hopefully favorable terms. It's basically the investment of confidence by the underwriters. So I think that it's a function of leading companies in the right direction. Look, if all cyber insurance did was transfer the risk financially, that would be valuable. But the truth is that it's helping companies to develop risk management response policies. It's helping companies assess their overall cyber posture. It's becoming ingrained in the whole cyber risk management approach throughout enterprises.
I would just add, so to build on to some of your comments, I think, I mean, fundamentally, there is risk transfer. That's a core part of the product, but there are these potential additional benefits that you can get, one of which is this idea that if you have an organization that comes to you and buys this risk transfer, then ideally they're thinking about the whole overall risk management process. So that means they're already mitigating and spending significant amounts on mitigation, and realize that they also want to do some transfer as well. There's also this fact that the insurers go through this process of evaluating clients and ensuring that you are spending enough on mitigation. So if you want to get a reduced premium, then you need to take certain steps and show that you've taken it. So so that's definitely a benefit. In terms of the moral hazard question, I would say it's not really a concern now, in particular because most companies cannot fully ensure the potentially unbounded scope of what a cyber insurance loss could be. There are frequently companies say that large companies are not able to necessarily even buy as much coverage as they might even want to, and then, so there are still relatively low caps on the amount of coverage you can get, and so worst case events go way beyond what tend to be covered. So that's one thing. The final point I'll make is that the existence of data breach notification obligations through these state laws has really helped bootstrap the cyber insurance market for reimbursing costs surrounding data breach. So, and the fact that there is this obligation to disclose creates the obligation for companies to have these costs and then make them go ahead and get insurance and file claims. Other forms of cyber insurance or other forms of cybersecurity and cybersecurity risks, there's still a calculation as to whether or not you necessarily even want to file a claim with your insurer because you might then have to publicly report it. And so, so that's an example of the policy intervention of data breach notification enabling cyber insurance.
Can I ask, so Matt, you made one comment that was curious. You said, tell me if this is wrong, insurance companies are profitable, therefore that shows that we are able to properly assess risk?
It shows that these companies who have been writing cyber risk for 10 to 15 years and making profits on it are doing their jobs well.
I guess that's the part I don't understand. So the more profitable the company is, the better it shows that they're able to assess the risk. So the profitability comes from having premiums, issuing premiums, but suffering no claims, right? If there are no claims, then the firm carrier is going to be most profitable.
They have claims. What they're trying to do is assemble a portfolio of diverse companies.
Oh,
And they're trying to, well, I mean, we can go back to 101 and explain the insurance industry, but there's undoubtedly the profitability of an insurance company in writing cyber portfolios is testament to how well of a job they're doing.
But that profitability comes from diversification of the portfolio as opposed to being perfectly able to assess the cyber risk.
There's no perfectly to anything in the world. Government decisions are never made in a continuum of perfection. Educational decisions are never made in a continuum of perfection. Economic models are never drawn up in a continuum of perfection. What there is an assessment of what maturity of organizations are. And it's not just diversification. It's an evaluation of security posture. If an insurance company spots a potential insured that has flagrant weaknesses and a lot of exposure, the market will recoil. And as a result, the prices for premium of that company will go up. And to your point, the amount of limits out there for that company will be less. I think that is a completely appropriate market response for a cyber assessment.
Can I just, let's say you have, and this is a common thing, $1 billion company, 3% of revenue spent in IT, and 10% of that being spent in cybersecurity. So $1 billion company could realistically be spending $3 million a year in a security program. That company may choose to insure to protect against the breach of something like 5 or 10 million records. That policy would cost somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000. Let's say that you double it. Let's say that you triple it. If it's $150,000, the incentive to me or to my team to really build a $3 million program in order to reduce $50,000 off of my insurance doesn't make sense. So I find some sort of, I don't, my personal experience, and this could be an anomaly, is that that's not a dialogue point in any of the discussions that I'm having with any of my peers nor with my executive team. And then the other thing that I would offer is, and I don't know that your firm or your firm may operate differently, but I've been in a couple of rounds of purchasing this cyber insurance, and the brokers come in and they bring a group of folks to ask some questions, and categorically the questions are insufficient to tell really what's happening. So it seems, or it would appear, if I'm extrapolating, that we're doing assessments similar to demographic assessments in like car insurance, where you say you look and behave in a particular way, you're 20 years old, you're a male, you live in this area code, and therefore we're going to classify or price this policy in a particular way, which is different than the more informed version of plug this thing into your car and we'll measure your accelerations and decelerations and the way that you actually behave on the road. And so it looks like the questions that are asked are more targeted towards mitigating or adequately litigating not paying an insurance claim, and it looks like the instruments that we have to measure cyber liability are dramatically insufficient. Just from, that's my perspective, and I know that that could be different than your perspective.
Well, the instrument to measure cyber liability has got to be data on what's been paid out before, and we are certainly at nascent days of the standard of care. Now, as far as coming in and asking what those questions are, one of the things that you should be aware is that there are more and more tools that are becoming available to underwriters to actually assess risk. But you're right, unless you're within the footprint and doing a forensic assessment, you're not really going to know what's going on. But the fact is that from a macro standpoint, are they looking at different sectors and companies within that sector and being able to judge them one over another from the survey they get, the questions for follow-up, some kind of external data analysis? You get a decent picture for the purposes of insurance. Now, is that going to stop cyber attacks? No, but we're not stopping cyber attacks. We're managing cyber risk. We're helping industries become more resilient.
Can I say one?
In the interest of time, I think we have to move on. But you'll be happy to know that we're going to hand the mic to you. So we're going to turn now to the mechanics of how companies actually make decisions about investing in security. And to start us off, I'm going to ask Larry to explain the model that you've developed for cybersecurity investments. So there is.
So you want me to click this?
Yeah, you got your slides here. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so I think if this is a framework, I'm not lost in the mathematics. There's a lot of mathematics that analyze it. So the framework is very simple. It's a process where you look at, I think it was Matt who mentioned with the cyber insurance, that you look at companies, you want to know what data you're trying to take care of, what's the value of it. So the first thing you want to do is figure out, what data you're trying to protect, what's the value of it, and the value of it is in terms of how much could you lose, the cost to you. So that's part of the value. Okay, and then the other thing is what's the probability of a breach, and then lastly is how effective are your investments, the productivity of investments. So there's three very simple aspects to the process. One is, what's the value of the information you're trying to protect? What's the probability of having a breach? And what's the productivity of the investment? And so without going through mathematics, you look at those three things. You could develop a grid like you see in the middle. They have the chart. The chart on your left-hand side, all it's basically saying is exactly, I think it was Matt or someone else mentioned, that if you put more money into investments the first dollar, you get more out of it than you get the second. So the value of the investment is the benefits are increasing at a decreasing rate. And that's really all the left-hand chart says. But it also says there's an optimal amount to invest. I don't know the optimal amount. It would change for every company. And no matter what you think it is ex ante, ex post, it's probably not going to be the right amount. But what I would argue is following some sort of a rigorous process over time, taking into consideration what the others here on the panel were saying, that resilience and looking at what I consider control, seeing how you did at the end of the period. So you make these decisions ex ante and ex post, you evaluate it, and then you move into the next phase. So it's a continuous feedback process, and that's the intent. The nice thing about that middle grid there is to suggest that you could come up with a grid and look at how much you think you might want to invest in different databases. I'm a big believer in segmenting databases. So you can look at how much to invest in databases. But the nice thing about it is you can do a simulation around it. So you don't like my probabilities that I threw in, throw in a whole bunch of your own and do a probability assessment. You could also, the value of the information, no one knows exactly the value in terms of what you're trying to protect, what you could lose, but you could do a simulation around that. So that's the whole idea here. The last little picture on the right-hand side, all that's saying is that it started off as an academic model. It was originally published in a computer science journal with a lot of mathematics. And eventually, I kept saying to my co-author, Marty Loeb, and actually one of the other papers we wrote, Joe Lay, who's actually sitting in the audience, we actually came up with an example, and we tried to show how to use the process. And to my surprise, the Better Business Bureau picked it up and actually put it in the 2017 report and recommended it to all small businesses in North America to think in terms of this framework. Again, not using, not getting caught up in the actual numbers per se, but it's a process that you go through and you figure out, the value of the information, probability of a breach, and what do you get for additional investments. So what's the productivity of investments? And so that's all that slide shows.
I think you have another slide.
I have another slide. I can just, I've actually, it's something Michael asked about. This one was about incentives and government incentives, and it really got to the issue of, what can the government do in terms of giving incentives? Most incentives that were in the slide that Elisa had before were really thinking from the firm's point of view. So the government's been looking at lots of incentives. They give tax incentives, grants, and so on. But it's not that obvious that giving incentives, will increase security. One of the problems is we don't really have a clean measure of security. So all this little slide is supposed to show is that you can show very easily that the government, if a firm was already allocating their funds in an optimal manner, then government incentives, which would shift their allocation if they had a budget constraint, Michael's point, would shift it away from a better solution. On the other hand, if they can increase their budget, then government incentives would tend to increase the level of security. So that's the bottom line of what's on there. That was actually, I should mention that the first, can I go back on that?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, how do I go back?
The red button.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, so I should mention the model was when we originally developed it, we were being supported by NSA. And going forward, this one,
That's okay. I was going to.
yeah, and that's okay. And DHS actually was very interested in what kind of incentives we could give to the private sector as a government, to increase security. And so we looked at some of the issues, and this was one of the things that we talked about in our report. But there's no absolute. I'm not lost in the mathematics. I think the mathematics gives you insight, and then actually, looking at the process. So
I want to follow up. The first picture here, the declining function, or the function that's increasing at a decreasing rate. That's the productivity of investments.
Right.
So I think Sasha was alluding to this earlier, that nobody really knows the shape of that function to some extent, right? And it's a big component of where the optimal point on that curve is what that curve looks like. So does anybody, Larry, you could start us off, but does anybody have any ideas on how we could maybe go about estimating what that curve looks like?
So we originally, what we looked at was different, we called them security breach functions. So we looked at different productivity functions of investments, and based on a couple of broad classes of investment productivity functions, we were able to show that there is an optimal level, and it's much less than a lot of people think. It's roughly 1/3 of the expected loss. Mathematicians around the world started to say this is nonsense. I got emails saying this is voodoo economics, and then eventually a mathematician in Russia and one in France around the same time said these guys stumbled on something that's more powerful than even they realized. He was right for me, but not my colleague. He knew it was right. So Marty Loeb, who's not here, I went to Marty. I said, maybe the guy's right. These were math professors, and he says, and so we did look at different productivity functions, but you can find some that it doesn't work. All that graph is intended to show is that it's just diminishing marginal returns to levels of investments. You put in, if you look at your opportunities, you should be able to get more for the first million than for the second million, or whatever you're investing in. If it's a small company, more for the first 10,000 than you'd get for the next 10,000. And so ever since the Better Business Bureau came out and recommended the framework, again, they recommend the framework. They don't say get lost in the mathematics. I've had lots of small companies come and talk to me, and I talk about the framework. It's a, you know, it's a process. You're better off to use some kind of formal process than just, you know, ad hoc pull some number out of the air. But you're never going to get the right number. One big breach and the whole thing falls apart.
So the folks with Rich Searson and Doug Hubbard did some additional research that I think complements and maybe contradicts in some places. But what they were able to do is start from the foundation that there is a way to make calibrated predictions about things that we can't measure today or have been unsuccessful because we don't have the adequate information to measure today. And I think the other thing that they highlighted was that there's some false thinking out there stemming from statistical illiteracy around how much data you actually need to come up with functional models. But at the end of the day, what is true is using calibrated analysis, calibrated assessments with folks who have expert judgment, you can get fairly accurate estimates of probability. And I think using that information with a properly calibrated expert, you can actually get fairly accurate estimates. But I forget, was it Sasha or you, Tyler, the validation that this is in fact the appropriate curve or this is the best model, I don't think we have empirical evidence to support that part, right?
I agree completely. So I should just tell you, we had a consulting firm in D.C., I won't mention the name, said, let's take your model and we'll go to all of our clients and we'll bill you out at a high rate and you'll get a great consulting fee. My response was, what, are you crazy? Any number we give them is not going to be the right number, but you're better off to go through a process. Let them try. Each firm is different. And exactly, you know, what Matt said, with the right experts in the firm, they can. It's better than just pulling numbers out of the air. And over time, I would argue, the same way I would argue for net present value models, I would argue that they're better off doing it that way than just ad hocly pulling numbers out. And I think, you know, what our other Matt said was that even insurance companies, you look at what kind of information you're trying to protect. What is it you're doing? You know, and so it's a formal process. And so even though you may have thought I'm going to come in here and try to sell you on mathematics, I'm not. You know, I understand. There is some real mathematics underlying this.
So, I think in some sense the question is like, the question may have been, how can we collect data to maybe, best validate what this model is? And I think maybe that's not the right question. I think the real problem that we face is that we don't have data on effectiveness of controls, right? And so, and we maybe have some point estimates of the likelihood of different categories of security events like breaches and how they could vary by sector. But what we have very little insight right now onto is how effective these particular security controls are, or even this class of security controls are against these kinds of threats. And if you were to increase your investment in this control or across these suites of controls, how would that reduce your expected losses? And we just have no idea. Okay, I think I've been provocative enough to elicit a disagreement. But I would argue we don't have a good sense of what the what the true costs of an attack is, and more importantly, how effective certain defensive countermeasures are. And I think part of the reason why is I think there is just not a lot of interest among the vendors and designers in the cybersecurity industry in providing this, and it's hard to do. I think it's very hard to do, but it's also not something that they're interested in providing. And so I think fundamentally that's something that we need to make more progress on if we're going to get more effective security investment. Sasha.
Yeah. So yeah, that's true. I was initially, I probably sounded very critical of the insurance industry, and I don't mean to be. I probably was when I initially started doing some of this research that, oh my God, we all turn to insurance companies because we think that they should have the perfect answers for everything and they should be these wonderful seers that can provide perfect assessments. And so I started looking at these rate schedules and saw that, look, this is not quite great. But the reality is that even I wouldn't know how to do a completely accurate assessment, right? I can give you a good idea of what to look for, but even I wouldn't be able to do that. And I think they're trying, right? So that, you know, you can see the evolution of these policies evolving over time, and I think that's a good thing. I do think that they provide the only opportunity to get at exactly the kind of data that we really want, right? Exactly the kind of answers that we want to understand, which is what kinds of security controls matter and by how much. And they have that through the claims data. And this isn't rocket science, right? All this takes is a bit of statistics, a bit of a regression. So you can imagine in your head a spreadsheet where all of the rows represent the cyber policies that a carrier has or a group of carriers have, right? So every policy. The columns, the first column represents whether or not a claim has been filed, yes or no, say in the past 12 months. And all of the other columns represent properties of those firms, the industry, the size, number of employees, and then answers to the security questionnaires, what kinds of controls they actually had. And you just run a regression and you get an answer. And maybe it's not a perfect answer, maybe not everything is statistically significant, but you start to get at a sense of here are the kinds of processes, procedures, security controls, whatever, that actually matter in a statistical way of affecting whether or not a breach occurs and a claim has been filed. Right? That's it. It's nothing more sophisticated than that. Yes, there are issues with data and data cleaning. Do we have the right kinds of questions and whatever? But that is one way, that is the only way that I know of to be able to get at a way to validate this model and get at very useful kinds of questions.
And I would just say there may be some sampling bias. Having worked at a couple of firms and actively participated in the process of helping companies respond to data breaches and other kinds of security compromises, I think it's very rare that those data breaches actually get publicly disclosed. So I would say, you know, fewer than 2 or 3%, if I had to put a number on it. And so I think the information that we do have that would come out of the insurance folks should be properly caveated to take into account that there's a set of drivers that cause people to disclose, and not all data compromises or security incidents or what have you are effectively represented in the data that the insurance companies have.
Dude, my research is full of caveats.
Yeah.
I have no problem with caveats. But that doesn't mean it can't be done.
Sure.
We can't try.
Yeah.
So firms are reporting that they are spending more money on cybersecurity. Do you think that even if we don't know necessarily what controls are the best in particular instances, if we don't have that kind of data, can we look at kind of overall spend to get a rough sense as to the security at an organization? If you're looking at it from a regulator's perspective, or if you're coming into an organization as new security personnel or on a consulting gig, can you look at that rough spend and get some sense as to likely security?
If you had the number, that would be great. The problem is firms don't report how much they spend on cybersecurity. I've got about 10 studies. I'm sure everyone else who does research in the area has about 10 studies waiting to go if they had that kind of a number. In fact, I actually, when I testified in Congress, I actually said one of the things that would be great if we could have is somehow have firms report how much they actually invest in cybersecurity.
It's a really common metric for when you're applying for cyber insurance, how much but it's also very difficult to ascertain because it's not necessarily a clean budget item. You have cyber investment in a lot of different disciplines.
They're giving you private data. That's not publicly available.
No, it's confidential.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So it's hard to,
Yeah, it's not in their 10K.
yeah, right, that's what I meant.
I mean, definitely going to be correlation. I think the correlations can be very noisy, and furthermore, because we have these problems about information asymmetries, about the quality of investments, we have these systemic problems that will make it very, very noisy. I mean, it's yeah, that's what I'd say.
So there are some sources of data like Gartner and Forrester and IANS and other folks who do aggregate benchmark data, and then they share that, functional data. I mean, it's a part of every CISO's pitch deck for whether you're getting more or less money. You include it when it helps you, and you don't when it doesn't. So.
All right, let's turn now to another slide. So this is a polling question, so I'd like to ask this question to the panel. So who provides or should provide incentives to invest in data security? And to a certain extent, this overlaps with where we started our discussion. So A, culture, which could be security professionals, executives, or boards. B, customers or consumers. C, cyber insurance. D, law, whether the source of that is state statutes, data breach litigation, federal agencies, or E, other, or you can choose some combination thereof. So let's run down the panel and hear each of your answers, and let's do the reverse from last time. So let's start with Larry.
It's simple, A through D, probably add E also. You can come up with that. There's no one incentive. That's what, we started off with incentive. There's no one incentive. I know one thing, the SEC certainly has now become very interested in cybersecurity risk, starting in 2011 when they came out with their disclosure guidance from the Corporate Finance Division, then in 2018 when the Commission came out with a statement on cybersecurity risk, and then in 2018, on top of that, the Enforcement Division came out with internal controls, accounting internal controls should take into consideration email breaches. And I think these are all incentives, and I think every one you got listed there, as I look at them, you can pick one, but I think they're all important. I think they're all important. So I'm copping out on you, but I believe that.
Yeah. And for D, I don't really look at things like litigation and mandated compliance regimes as an incentive. I view that as the other side of the coin. And an incentive should really be about, okay, other than meeting my bare minimum compliance requirements, what are my interests in going above that model? And there's a lot of ways to achieve it, as Larry said. I mean, I think what you really do it for is A and B. You do it for your corporate reputation, and you do it to make sure that you have customer trust and that you're going to have that good faith and that good name. But I think that there's a lot of mechanisms in which the government can participate to provide incentives. I would give as an example from the terrorism world, the Department of Homeland Security Safety Act, which gives litigation protections for companies that are able to demonstrate that they have security that is more likely than not to deter a terrorist incident. You can apply for Safety Act protection. Things like that I would consider more of an incentive rather than the Luca Brasi incentive of you got to do this.
Okay, I will do a variation on what Larry said, and I'll give you a rank ordering. So I think ideally it would come from the customers and consumers. And in the cases when you can get that, when the consumer demands sort of naturally align, let's go with that. That's great. Doesn't always work out. And when it doesn't work out, you better hope that the companies themselves have a culture to make the right investments and to do the right thing. And if that doesn't, and one of the ways in which that could be magnified is through cyber insurance, and that it can provide sort of an outside perspective to sort of validate what you're doing, and also provide some sense of what the true costs of insurable events are. So that sort of can magnify a company whose culture is already in the right place. But then I think the last step has to be the law, and I think because you're not going to get complete coverage from just those first three, because of the presence of the market failures I talked about earlier. And in terms of what the law can do, I think the law can do steps to remedy those actions. In particular, try to mitigate the information asymmetries by collecting and disseminating data that would enable us to evaluate security controls more effectively, for example, by having increased disclosure about cybersecurity risks, some of which we're already seeing through the SEC guidance, as Larry alluded to. litigation, as a stick in the event of companies that just are not acting in good faith. And so that's the order in which I would put it. I think you need them all. There you go.
That's kind of interesting. It seems like you're implying that the law should sort of act as a force multiplier for the first three. It's like you should give information to consumers so that consumers can direct incentives. You should, impose liability so that cyber insurance has teeth and things like that.
Absolutely,
Is that
I'm a
accurate?
believer. I'm a believer in capitalism, and I think when you have to have government intervention, it needs to be in order to make private markets work better.
Yeah, so I think D provides the floor, right? It's a compliance, the statutes, the enforcement actions, it provides the floor. And then comes from customers. So to the extent that customers actually care about firm behavior, they have an opportunity to drive things. I don't see that happening, right? We had a discussion earlier about the extent to which firms invest and respond to whether or not firms compete on privacy and security. And I don't think investment in different kinds of technologies provides you that answer, and I don't really see that much of a market for it anyway. It's an old problem, and we've talked about it a lot, but I don't see it changing. I think the board, I don't see much of an impact from A, right? The board's going to respond to costs and different threats, and those costs are going to come from consumer behaviors. And again, if the consumer behavior isn't there, if like that pressure isn't there, they're not going to respond. And the same with cyber insurance. Right now, I just don't see it as having a great opportunity for driving the incentives.
Yeah, I'm remarkably aligned with what Sasha shared. The law and the compliance is driving the floor, and for those folks that are looking to be check in the box, that helps pull them back into reality and do the right thing. But for those folks that have come to the conclusion that cyber resilience makes sense, then you have a combination of customer demand and culture that's driving the story forward. And I think cyber insurance is a part of an overall risk management strategy, but I don't see that as an incentive, frankly, at all. I think when you think about drawing up the laws, it's important to consider we have organizations with varied business models. That means different margins and ability to invest in things, and we also have a different size and scale of organizations. And so, not that this is news to you guys, but what that means is that you have an entire set of check-the-box customers that we encountered in my consulting days quite frequently that would benefit a lot from increasing the floor. And then I think what you find on the top end is compliance can be disruptive and redirect investments in unhealthy ways. So for example, we help people move to the cloud. When people are in the cloud, the technology behaves very differently, but the rules in the compliance standards are written in ways that make us have to jump through additional hoops in order to solve things in ineffective ways when we could get stronger security outcomes using new technology paradigms. So I just would also put that on the, on the docket. The compliance certainly does, for those more innovative and secure firms, actually create a drag. And that's an unfortunate reality. Yeah.
I want to thank all of the panelists for their time and their insights. We are now going to take a 15-minute break. We'll start back here at 2:45 with a panel discussion of consumer demand for security.
Thank you very much. I thought we
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the third session of the day on the consumer demand for security. Again, my name is Jared Ho, and I'm an attorney in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection. I'm joined by Mark Lapino, an economist in our Bureau of Economics. We'll start out this session today first with a presentation from Justin Brookman from Consumer Reports on the standards that Consumer Reports uses to evaluate security. Then we'll kick it off to a moderated portion of our panel with a polling question. As with previous panels in the morning, there'll be event staff walking around with question cards. If you have a question, please flag one of them down. They will collect the cards and pass them up for us to read. And then with that, do you want to give introductions?
Sure. I'll briefly introduce our panelists. To my left, we have Justin Brookman, who's the Director of Consumer Privacy and Technology Policy for Consumer Reports Advocacy. Michael Higgins is a 30-year veteran of the information security industry and has previously served as the CISO for NBC Universal, New York Times, and LexisNexis. Wiley Hodges is a Director in Product Marketing at Apple. Kirsten Martin is an Associate Professor of Strategic Management and Public Policy at George Washington University's School of Business. And Rick Walsh is an Associate Professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Media and Information, where he co-directs the Behavioral Information and Technology Lab. With that, I will turn it over to Justin.
Thanks. Can I have the clicker? Thank you. So I was asked to give a little presentation on what we're doing at Consumer Reports around consumer demand for security. So first, just like a couple words about Consumer Reports in general. I think most of y'all know we test lots of stuff, right? We have 7 million members now, test about 7,000 products a year. I think generally well recognized as independent and expert and data-driven in the advice and information we make available to folks. A few years ago, though, I think we started to recognize that we really weren't capturing all the elements of a lot of modern products, especially connected and smart products. So we started to think about how can we start to test and evaluate products and services for things like privacy, for things like security, for things like ownership, right? Do you even own our products anymore? Do we have the right to resell them, the right to repair them? Things like interoperability. If I have a bunch of smart things in my house, will they talk to each other? How do you give and evaluate points to products based on that sort of thing? And so the digital standards, a project we launched a couple of years ago. Originally, Consumer Reports sitting down with some partner organizations, Ranking Digital Rights, who's part of New America, the Cyber Independent Testing Lab, and Disconnect, who makes privacy tools like the Disconnect ad blocker. And started to think, okay, if we're going to evaluate products based on privacy and security, what are the criteria, what are the elements that we're going to look for? And so we published this document online. It's available if you search for the digital standard, articulates things like, product support over time, control of information, what the policies say. It's an open source document. It's available on GitHub. We're constantly reevaluating it and looking at it and tweaking it. I'm going to spend some time in the document on Friday making some suggestions based on some of the testing we've done so far. So if you have ideas, if you want to take a look and think about some of the things that we suggest and make some suggestions for refinements, we would certainly appreciate that. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the actual elements in the standard for things that we look at on data security. So use of encryption. Is data transmitted encrypted on the device? Is it encrypted in transit? Ideally, we would look to see if it's encrypted in the cloud server side, but that's kind of hard for us to evaluate. Commitment to support periods is a really important thing for us. Right now, there's not a lot of information available to folks about how long. If I buy a smart TV, will it be supported for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 1 year, no year? Not a lot of information available about that. When I was here at the Federal Trade Commission a couple of years ago, we did a report on smartphones, how long smartphones are supported for. Found just a vast, wide range of practices, right? Some super expensive flagship phones just didn't get any support, were vulnerable to attacks right out of the box. Some phones got supported for like years and years and years. Right now, not a lot of information for folks about that. Resistance to attacks, so there are certain penetration tests we can do in our labs about things to see if things are vulnerable to certain common types of attacks, and can we do that ideally without violating the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Passwords, again, obviously the password should not be password out of the box, but do they support long passwords? Do they allow cut and paste from password managers? Do they have a bug bounty program? So they encourage third-party researchers to come and say, hey, we found this problem on your site, a process for taking those sorts of things into account. Security oversight, do they have a security oversight program? Again, hard for us to test. We may not be able to have a lot of visibility into that, but there may be some indicia we could look at as representing that they have a program in place. Do the updates happen automatically? Even if a product's supported, it's not going to do a user a lot of good if my router software is available on router.com but doesn't come to my device. Maybe give credit for automatic updates that are pushed to the device. On the other hand, what if they're bundled with functionality updates as well? There's recently criticism of Epsom for bundling security updates with updates that actually impinge upon someone's use of the product. So how do we consider that? Multi-factor authentication is something that can, in some cases, be useful for security. Best build practices is the product not overly complicated? Is it not overly reliant on third-party code and libraries, which might introduce some fragility into the system? Are folks told about changes? If my password's changed, will I be told about it by email or some other service? And then are updates authenticated? Is it actually authenticated from coming from the server, from the manufacturer? This is just a handful of them that I thought would be useful to kind of like walk through what we're thinking. There are more on the site and that we're trying to operationalize in some of our testing. And so the goals of this, I think, should be obvious. Right now, there's not a lot of information readily available to folks in the marketplace about privacy and security practices. So if folks do want to make security-conscious choices, this will empower them to do so. At least as important is kind of pushing the supply side as well. Right now, I think a lot of companies don't have accountability for dodgy practices. They kind of skate by on ignorance of folks knowing what's going on. If we give a company a low rating, they get mad at us. They take these things seriously. They'll call us and complain and occasionally sue us. So if we can introduce some degree of accountability for practices that, I think we've all seen in the security space, a lot of like common practices are actually just things that could easily be remedied. Certainly a lot of the FTC's data security practices are things that really should have been captured, but somehow they just skated by on. I think the Equifax security breach, which was reported on in the Senate oversight hearing the other day, showed things, again, that really should have been captured from the beginning. If we can push folks on the supply side to think more about these things in advance, I think that's good for the ecosystem. And so I'm going to walk through a couple of slides about how we've been doing this, how we've been kind of like building out our program. Originally, just looking at kind of occasionally things like apps, so investigative journalism type things. Here's an app we looked at called Glow, which is a woman's fertility app. Has access to super sensitive information about folks, and we dove into it and found like a lot of security vulnerabilities. Again, things that could have easily been addressed. Passwords could have been changed by attackers. Attackers could get access to pretty sensitive stuff without being authenticated. In this case, we did responsible disclosure, went to the app manufacturers, explained at length all of our findings and concerns, and before we published, we got them to address them. But this is how we first started thinking about how do we apply the digital standard in practice. Then last year, we did an expose on some smart TVs on data security and privacy. On security, again, we didn't see any of these companies promising to update software or provide security support for any period of time. So consumers have to kind of go in hoping and guessing. We found a couple of security vulnerabilities in the Samsung and Roku TVs. Attackers would be able to change channels and put on objectionable content and put the volume to 99. Again, more nuisance type stuff, but things that probably should not be possible to be done. I know at least in the case of Samsung, they agreed and did actually update their software to address the concerns. On the privacy side, this is something I worked on when I was here at the Federal Trade Commission as well. A lot of smart TVs have the capacity to watch what you're watching, so they'll kind of take snippets of what you're watching and send it back to the lab, and then they can kind of build out a pretty dense behavioral profile about all the things that you do on your television. I think because of the FTC's work on the Vizio case, they all kind of asked for permission. They all pushed you through some screen where you had to press OK. Varying ways of doing that, varying degrees of how good that was. Again, from Consumer Reports perspective, how do we evaluate user design like this? How do we give points for how big the OK is and where the skip or don't or say no button is? So definitely a concern for us about how to evaluate on privacy, but also for security choices as well. And now more recently we started to actually translate these into Consumer Reports ratings. So this is one from a couple of months ago. We looked at some mobile peer-to-peer payment services. Fortunately, to avoid any awkwardness in this panel, Apple ended up doing quite well in this evaluation. You can see we look at things like we might look at otherwise, like authentication. Is there customer support? Do folks, but then 2 of the 5 categories that we have are also on data privacy and data security. And Apple Pay is actually very thoughtfully designed to actually limit the amount of information that Apple itself ever collects by any transaction, to limit the way that any information could be used for identity theft in the future. So in this case, Apple did really quite well on both privacy and security. Other the companies, getting in, it's hard to test, right? I mean, information could be sold or leaked or used on the back end without a lot of visibility into us. We had to rely in large part on the disclosures they make, and some of the companies reserve pretty broad rights to do lots of stuff with your personal information. So in this case, they ended up scoring not as well. And these were things that were incorporated in the overall score. Some of the challenges that we're confronting so far. One, we actually have to rely on documentation in a lot of cases, and it's often not really illuminating. Y'all have looked at privacy policies. Privacy policies today are not really designed to convey meaningful information to folks. They're compliance documents that are designed to evade liability. So if you're actually trying to look at what companies are doing on privacy, it's actually hard to tell. Even if you have the time, like I do, to review privacy policies for a living, it's hard to get a lot of information about it. Right now, we don't have a lot of information about how long products are being supported. Like I said, I think we'd like to build that out over time if, in fact, Samsung washing machines get updated longer than others. We'd want to be able to say that. That could go into some sort of reliability type metric that could be incorporated into ratings overall. Right now, we don't have that. Right now, there's not a lot of ground truth we can point to. Even trying to go back in time and try to figure out how long the products have been supported is actually quite challenging, but something that we're committed trying to figure out. Some things that's really tough to test. Do we have to compile every software system? I mean, even if we could, it's actually quite challenging and expensive to do that. And then there's lots of things we can't. Like, again, anything server side, we don't have any insight into. There, we have to rely on the documentation. Like I said, it's not enough information that we would like. And then, how you translate a set of tests to a constantly evolving set of product buckets. Products are different. They may have different threat models. They have access to different types of information. So information on a phone is very different than a smart TV. And so how do you do that sort of changing and testing at scale? Scores are going to be subjective. We try to make them as objective and repeatable as possible, but you're going to, I identified 12 out of a handful of criteria that we're trying to compress into a fairly narrow set of information. And how do you do that reliably and fairly? How do you give points for vulnerabilities that they actually patched? Like the example of Glow, we looked at you found a bunch of different vulnerabilities, and so if a company says, okay, we patched them all, give us a perfect score, how do you take into account what may have changed? And and things change overnight, right? I mean, a software update can change everything radically. It may not even be a software update. It could just be some interface change. It could be a policy change. It could be a practice change that we don't have any way to check for. And so how do you, again, if you're testing 7,000 products, not all of which are connected, but more and more are, how do you set up systems to keep track of them over time and to make sure the scores are accurate? And then, just closing, I think this will probably transition to some things that the panelists are going to talk about. That I think the demand-side approach is incredibly important, and providing more information is essential. I don't think it can entirely solve the problem. So one, not all security threats are felt by consumers, right? If my smart refrigerator is being used to DDoS Jared, I may not care, right? It's not affecting me, so I'm not really incentivized to price that into my smart TV or smart refrigerator choice. Folks sometimes have trouble assessing security risks. This is complicated stuff. A lot of folks don't necessarily understand all the security ramifications from a connected or smart device. Even if they did, consumers are not necessarily great at assessing tail risk, right? This is an essential part of behavioral economics. People underprice risk, which is why we made the policy choice to mandate seatbelt use in cars. Testing will provide imperfect data. We don't have access to everything, so we're trying to input more information into the marketplace, but it's not as precise as this company is providing $13 worth of security. It's necessarily a lot more lossy than that. And attribution is always going to be delayed, and if at all possible, in the security space. If my information, if I'm subject to a identity theft 5 years down the road, I may not know that it was X company's practices that did that 5 years ago. So there's necessarily some kind of disconnect between my market choices there. So for these reasons, I think it's kind of essential that information is important, but we definitely need policy enforcement as well. So encourage the FTC to encourage what it's been doing under Section 5, but ideally with a dedicated security statute too. And with that, I'll turn it back to y'all. Here.
Great, and thank you, Justin, for that presentation. And I know that we'll be returning to questions about the tools available for consumers to comparison shop based on security later on in our discussion. But first, I wanted to turn to a polling question, and it's really more of a scale than it is a polling question. But so in our last panel, it was suggested that some folks were not entirely convinced that there is a consumer demand for security, or that perhaps that consumer demand isn't quite there yet. And I think that this spectrum, or this polling question, sort of gets to that. And so, I'd like to sort of ask our panelists sort of what their thoughts are on the consumer demand of security, and sort of where you think that we fit on this scale. On one end, is security important to is security important to consumers, and who bears sort of the responsibility for security? Do they expect that firms bear the responsibility solely, or do they understand or appreciate that it's a shared responsibility between firms and themselves? Is it a moderate sort of appreciation or demand for security, or do folks feel as though consumers don't expect security in the products, or some other category? So why don't we start with Rick, and we can go down the line.
Sure. I really like that this question, there's a logical option that's actually missing. It says firms are responsible, there's a shared responsibility. The third logical option is that consumers are entirely responsible, and that's actually not an option in this, and I think that's a good thing. So my opinion, in my experience and in my work, I think B is the closest, that people seem to really think that security is important. When people I talk to, they spend a lot of time trying to figure out, especially as they use consumer devices, as they use apps and websites, they try to figure out what they can do to help security. They often see it as a balancing act between what it is they're trying to accomplish and what the security goals are. I hear a lot of end consumers talking to me about how they're told something that they're supposed to do about security, such as don't write down your passwords, and then they realize that they can't get they can't accomplish their goals if they actually follow the security advice that they've been given, and they spend a lot of time trying to find a middle ground. So it's not that they're just going to ignore the security advice, it's that they're going to try to find a similar advice that they could give themselves that they feel accomplishes the similar security goals, but still allows them to get their work done. And to me, that's a real sign that they think security is really important, but they see it as kind of a shared responsibility. They know that they don't know everything about security. They look to advice from experts and advice from people like the FTC to try to figure out what they should be doing, but then they have to adjust that advice to whatever situation they're in and what their life is like. And that adjustment process is the really hard part, and I think that's where things are getting lost a little bit right now. So I would say B. People mostly think it's important, but they see it as a shared responsibility between themselves and the firm.
So I agree with you, especially around when we think about at the workplace. I wonder about consumer-facing products if it isn't closer to A, and that they don't see themselves as being a point of vulnerability to a larger system. I think when we're at the workplace and we have to not write down our passwords, and we have to have two-factor authentication, and all the academics get really mad and they don't want to do it. But we kind of understand that this is part of the larger system, that we have to do it to keep our system safe. And I don't know that they see it as a shared responsibility when they set security on their refrigerator, or they might see it on my phone, and I don't want my phone to be hacked and made into a brick, but not as a part of a larger system. It's similar to when, not that they should see it as a part of a larger system, but I'm not sure that they do. Interesting, we do think of that way around regular security, with like the ideas of see something, say something, that we're all points of vulnerability in a larger system. But when it comes to cyber, that messaging doesn't come through. There isn't that constant vigilance. So I would put us at A.
I think I'd want to get a hybrid of some of these, of course. I want to pick and choose, because I think that the concern about security is uneven. I think that consumers tend to place a high value on security in situations where they understand that there are security implications of the decision they're making. So one of the most salient examples being exchanging payment credentials of some sort, because they've been conditioned to expect that that's a security moment in their lives. But I actually believe that they don't understand always the implications of other things that are at least equally important to security. For example, I think updating software is a very important part of security, and it's something that I think the vast majority of consumers don't necessarily have a firm grasp of in terms of its implications. And so I think that they sense importance to it in certain situations, and in others they have absolutely no idea. It might be the externalities that were referred to earlier of, why does Bob care if his smart TV, is DDoSing Mary's network? And at the same time, I think that there are situations also where that risk to themselves in other situations becomes more visible. So in the news, there may be something. So at a moment in time, I think a consumer may have a great awareness of security and a great demand for it. But I think on average, on any given day, it's kind of an uneven thing.
I guess I'll be a little bit of a naysayer here. I think there's an F here. Present company excluded. I don't think the consumers really think it's important at all. And I say that with a lot of background information with what the consumers are doing. I think they're more concerned about that large screen TV being able to be 4K or play Amazon than they are about the security that's embedded in the TV to prevent Amazon from seeing what they're watching. I don't think Best Buy, if you go to a Best Buy tech employee, he's answered any security question probably in the last month about the security of a particular 4K TV. I just don't think, and it's based upon what Justin said, the externalities. We have made security violations of consumers to be painless. We have made the fines for stealing a credit card $50, and nobody ever charges that to the consumer for losing his credit card because they're afraid they'll cancel their credit card and go to a different credit card carrier. So they move around. We've made banking fraud was so pervasive a few years ago before the 9 federal agencies got together and mandated every bank had to institute two-factor because each bank was afraid because if they instituted and put security in, the consumers would rebel and go to another bank. So I think we wish that consumers were more important and more concerned about security, but I think their actual feet on the street, what their behavior is telling us is, sure, if you ask someone as they walk by, you consider, do you think security is important on your smart thermostat you have at home? Of course they're going to answer yes. But do you think they asked the question when they were buying it about what it's doing, where it's reporting, who's seeing the data out of it? I just don't think actions are speaking much louder than words in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I was inclined to kind of come down in between on moderately important, because I think people generally, as with privacy, they have a vague sense that there are things out there that could attack them. But I think when they're buying a smart TV, they're not thinking of it because they're not aware of what any possible risks could be, right? I mean, like when we did our story on smart TV privacy, people were very surprised, like, oh, it never occurred to me my TV might be listening to what I would do. It never occurred to me that if I type in my credit card information on my TV, that if it's not encrypted, that it could be attacked. And so I think generally in the connected world, people have a vague sense like, yeah, this stuff's important. Being able to make individual choices, which is why we're trying to provide some more accountability for it, is actually quite difficult. On the whose responsibility, I think that this I feel more firmly that I think people expect it to be taken care of them for them, just because the firms are the ones who are the experts here, right? If I plug in my new smart hub home at home, like, I don't know what should I be doing. Nothing occurs to me as a consumer about what should be done. I think I expect that that's part of the product that I bought, that the experts will have put in place systems for authentication, systems to address all the things that we looked at. I mean, a consumer's not going to know whether there's a bug bounty program, right? So I think it's part of the default expectations that this is a responsibility of the company.
Can I just add one? I was just going to say, I think there's two different things going on here. One is it important to them? And the other is, do they trade on it in the market? And those are two completely different questions to ask. So is it important to me that my oven doesn't combust and catch on fire? Absolutely. Do I ask if it's going to combust and catch on fire? No, I just assume it's not going to do that. And so I think that there is just an assumption, and I'm not saying that this is correct. There needs to be greater understanding by the consumers, but that's why they're so surprised when we ask them, did you know that Amazon is getting access to this data? Did you know that the data aggregators are sniffing up all of your information? Those are privacy violations. Did you know that this was a security violation? And they're like, no, I would never have been okay with that. So I think that they think it's important, but they just assume like other certain product features that the firm is taking care of it. And so they aren't trading on it in the marketplace. So that would explain their behavior, and yet they're still shocked and upset when they find out that there's been a security violation.
So Kirsten, that's actually sort of a great segue into sort of our next conversation slide on the trade-offs. What are the other factors that consumers are that might be considering and that might go into the demand question. But before we get there, so it looks like we have a panel of highly esteemed guests, and we have 1A. It looks like we have 1A, 1B. Justin, I think you're more on the C line, and then we have an E. So, we can sort of see that there sort of is a wide range of sort of thought on this issue. And so I think this next slide might sort of get us into the conversation as to, why is there this discrepancy? Are there other factors at play? There certainly are. You flip on you turn on the paper, you read an article, and there's a security incident almost every single day. What is the reason for consumers buying, poor security products? Does it have to do with any of these factors on the list? And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Right. So, another prism you can think about this is the kind of the prism of product design, right, on the firm side. So, How do firms balance these potentially competing concerns of consumers that are kind of listed on the slide with concerns about security? And is the way that they do that, is that consistent with consumers' true preferences? Right? And is it useful to think about this problem in these terms of trade-offs? We can start with Justin.
Well, I don't design products for a living, so I was going to defer to someone who does.
Okay, I'll hop in since I do design products for a living. I think, one of these strikes me as kind of a strange outlier, and I know it's weird, it's the top of the list, cost, because I don't know that, I think Justin even mentioned it earlier, like a consumer doesn't really understand $13 worth of security, and frankly, that unevenness I mentioned also is reflected in what our customers demand. So we have some who actually demand a great deal of security from us, others who demand none at all, and we need to meet everyone somewhere that we can all be comfortable with. All these other things are trade-offs against one another, though. And in general, our experience is that we see the highest utilization and most satisfaction with security features that are automatic or nearly automatic. And our experience is that we improve security outcomes when we nudge or make invisible things that are good security practice. So great examples are, we found a few years ago that less than half of our users were setting passcodes on their phones. And that was a not good thing because that's a foundational element of security. And when we did a little, honestly not much, didn't take long to figure out what was going on, a little research, we found out that they were unlocking their phones on average 80 times a day. And that kind of presented to us exactly why they weren't setting passcodes on their phone, the friction. And so that's directly what led us into looking at biometric authentication, our Touch ID feature, and later Face ID, really reflect that desire to make something that's a much more natural and fluid way of interacting with a device and still preserving, some amount of security, hopefully a very good amount. We also see this with things like two-factor authentication. We rolled out various forms of two-factor authentication for Apple ID, for example, many years ago, and the adoption was abysmal. And part of that was on us because we didn't really work to make it seamless and transparent. Now, if you're migrating from device to device, people don't actually realize this, but very often they're actually effectively setting up a two-factor authentication system that installs tokens on their devices and all kinds of things, and it's happening completely behind their backs. In some ways, I don't love not being transparent about security. Both as a marketing person, I would love to trumpet what it's doing for you, but also the fact that sometimes we don't love the idea of not being fully transparent with our customers what's happening. But at the same time, we've found that that's where we get often the very best outcomes from a security perspective. So I'd say usability is probably the king here, productivity along with it, and functionality very nearly. I think latency is an odd one. I think it may apply more to things like e-commerce situations and things like that. From our perspective, what we see is that various technical innovations are continually removing any sort of computational or time cost of the security feature. So we're not really seeing that being nearly as big a factor.
And Wiley, just to follow up, so this slide is framed as trade-offs, suggesting or one or another approach, but perhaps some people have suggested perhaps it's more of like a scale or a spectrum, and so whereas the cost might be a factor, there might be sort of a solution. So you don't need to give up security for any one of these things. And so how does sort of Apple approach that on any of these factors?
Well, I think the answer varies with the specific aspect of security. And so I think a lot of it is an approach, you could call it an iterative approach, basically, where we will try something that we think is encouraging a good security behavior. We'll measure its effectiveness by looking at uptake and the way our customers employ it. And we will look at how we can improve that outcome as we go forward. Usually what we see is that users are prioritizing what I would call productivity or usability above almost everything else. It's the convenience that really governs their behavior. And so like I said, building things that are automatic or invisible really is what gives us the best outcomes. There are some situations where we won't do that. A good example today still is software update. where we want there to be some affirmative user action associated with it, in part because we think it's a moment that a consumer should have some control over. But we also want to strongly encourage that moment to happen because we believe there's immense security value in doing that. So sometimes we're balancing that ourselves to look at maybe it's a little more inconvenient this way, but we also want the consumer to have a sense of control because that also goes to building trust with the consumer, which we think is an important part of having them, have a sort of constructive security relationship with us. So when we ask them to do something, they might believe it's for a good reason.
So in addition to that, I really like the point you made about how there are some things that, when we can, it's really great if we can just kind of automate security. In an ideal world, it would be awesome if we could just say, hey, we made this secure, you don't have to do anything, you don't even know about it. But in practice, there's a lot of things where the users and the consumers have to be involved in the security aspects. It's interesting that you brought up software updates. I've actually done a lot of work on software updates. And one of the things that, there's an interesting, really clear trade-off around security and then usability because software updates often change functionality. And so and often the security ones do because they're preventing something happening that shouldn't be happening, but then they change the way things work. And if you start changing things underneath people, they can get upset. And so there was actually an intentional choice that consumers end up needing to make about how to trade off security in software updates. And that comes up in a lot of different security situations where you can't just entirely remove the user from the security decision. Authentication is another one that you came up with, which is like, there's no way to remove the user entirely from authentication. That wouldn't be authentication anymore. Yeah. And so we have to get the users involved and the consumers involved in in a number of these situations, and that's where we're running into the real challenges. You said it's somewhere between productivity and usability, and I agree. A lot of times when I talk to consumers about how they think about security, the answer is they don't answer with a security answer. They tell me why they're trying to, something they're trying to get done. So they look at their phone and they don't see a screen. They see, this is how I talk to my mom at night. Mm-hmm. And that's the important thing, is they want to be able to accomplish these things in their life that have meaning for them. And the security is the ability to do that. And so they see security as an enabling feature when they can and try to figure out how to use it. And I've heard that over and over again.
I think over the years, over the last decade or so, we've done, and Apple has led the way on it in many instances, we've done a good job at making security the formal setup. You're secure when you set up a machine. You're secure when you set up a router. For routers for more than a couple decades came preloaded with a username and password, and you had to actively go in and change it. You had to make a step and change that password and user ID to do it. And if you had that selection and you didn't do it, well, it still worked. In fact, you just plugged it in and it worked. It was a great router. Unfortunately, there was no security to it, and everybody that knew that username and password could get into your router and do all sorts of bad things to your life. But it took us a decade or more to convince the router manufacturers that, yes, that would impact usability for about a microsecond as people were setting up their routers, that they have to select a password. Even if it was weak, we thought a different password than the default was better than nothing. Not much better than nothing, but better than nothing. So I think it comes down to productivity with the users. I can't agree more. Usability for the user is the principle. When we set up New York Times Online, I was there when we were setting that up online, we set it up with a very low threshold for password when you first logged in your account. You're allowed to have multiple users in your account. So that you could have your child logging in from college and using and reading the New York Times Online, or your husband could on his iPad on the way to work, as well as you sitting at home. And we call it boiling the frog, but we slowly started adding security functionality and reduced the threshold to the accounts being misused. There was no harm to the consumers because consumer protection was one of our caveats when we set it all up. But the protection to the IP, the intellectual property, the news every day was important, and we started tightening that down over time to the point where it's 10 times more robust today than it was when it was first rolled out. And we did it over time because it was usability. If we had put that level of restrictions on those accounts those first few days, months, and weeks of when we did it, users would have never adopted it. They would have gone to the next online newspaper and used their services because they didn't have that inherent level of security on it. So it's important, it's a balance for a company to make. Usability is always going to be king, but you've got to trade that, you've got to balance that with security and understand that people, in spite of themselves, still need to be protected, and especially in their procedures. So I applaud what Apple's done over the years. You have to now physically turn off your little PIN number on your phone. You have to make a positive action and say, no, I don't want security, where it used to be, no, I want security. And everybody, I guess, in this room would say, I want that security, I want that privacy. But, you know, now it comes default, and you have to actively say, no, I don't want it. And I think that's a big step forward for the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I say like these balances are things that we're having trouble, we're thinking about when we're trying to evaluate services, right? So if we're giving someone a score for security, do we, you know, is it most secure or is it most reasonable secure under the circumstances, right? So if you have like a phone that doesn't connect to the internet, I mean, that's pretty secure, right? But how do you take into account the other issues? I mean, I know like we're looking at home security cameras the other day, and if one service doesn't have cloud storage, it all goes locally. And as a privacy advocate, I'm like, that's awesome. Like, just have it stored locally, and they can never get their paws on it. But then again, that has like usability. Like if you're somewhere else, like and may introduce other security elements as well. If we've heard about security elements of home servers. So how to balance these things? Like the example you come up with, like with automatic updates, like I said, like automatic updates like are get points, right? They're something that we look to. But the elements you articulated are also exactly right. Like there should be some consumer agency and control over that. So there's maybe some degree of friction saying, yes, I understand a security update is appropriate. So maybe that should be actually, maybe it should the push plus okay is the optimal result. And so trying to balance them into either overall scores or even just security specific scores is tricky.
Okay, Rick, I'd like to sort of discuss a little bit more the consumer aspect of consumer expectations, and you've written a fair bit on this, and I'd also be interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say, but maybe you can start us off with sort of your research on the issue of information asymmetries. Is that something that exists in the security context, and how do we resolve that asymmetry? Is it simply through more education, or is education not enough?
That's a really good question. There's two parts to that question. Do the information asymmetries exist, and how do we resolve that? One of them is easier than the other. Yes, I definitely think the information asymmetries exist. There's a lot of information out there, and it's really interesting. It's in different places. So we did a project where we're looking at the kinds of information that was available to consumers about computer security and about cybersecurity issues. And one of the things we found, we looked at 3 different possible sources of information. One was the kind of security advice that you see mostly coming out of the tech industry and places like the FTC or the FBI about how to protect yourself. We looked at news organizations, and then we also looked at a collection of kind of stories that individual consumers have been telling to each other about cybersecurity issues. And what we found, surprisingly, was that there was very little overlap in the kinds of information that they were talking about. So a lot of the advice from the experts seemed to really focus on threats and countermeasures. So what's the problem? And so like what is the kind of technical aspect of the problem? So authentication, someone could log in as you, and then how do you deal with that? You have a strong password. Interestingly, that kind of discussion almost never appeared in the news or amongst the security stories. The stories that people were telling to each other focused a lot more on who was doing this and why were they doing it. And that's actually really interesting because currently the way we're talking about cybersecurity doesn't really focus a lot on who the attackers and the perpetrators are and why they're doing this. And so I went into that a little bit deeper to try to understand why is it that people and a lot of consumers seem so interested in kind of sharing speculations about like why would someone log into my account as me? That was a really big issue that like most of the discussions in the news stories didn't really talk about. And the answer was because they were trying to make these trade-offs. So as they kind of live their life, there are these trade-offs that come up, like, do I have a stronger password and then have more trouble remembering it? Do I write it down? There's all kinds of trade-offs that get made as they try to live their lives, and they're trying to understand these trade-offs, and so to do that, they have to kind of envision the types of attacks and the types of problems that they possibly would run into. And so they really needed to know, all right, if someone got into my account, who would that be and what would they do? Because that really matters. If it's my kid's sister getting to my account and making fun of me, that's a lot different than someone from another country getting in and stealing lots of money. Right? Those are very different outcomes, and I would probably make different decisions based on that. And so trying to understand why people were, like why these attackers were attacking things and what the process was and how do these security decisions actually then influence and prevent those attacks was really important. When I talk to people about two-factor authentication, for example, right now, I hear a lot of people know what it is, they know they're supposed to do it, but they don't understand how it helps. And that's the thing that I'm not seeing a lot in a lot of the consumer education materials right now is, all right, why is this a good thing? If someone was going to try to break into your account, like why would two-factor authentication actually help stop them? And once I started explaining it to them, we've got a study we're doing right now where we're actually just sharing stories with people of ways that two-factor authentication stops an attack. And that seems to be very motivating. We're hoping that's what we're studying. We're looking at an experiment right now to try to figure out to what extent that it is motivating. But that seems to be one of the key aspects is this information asymmetry and not what the security features are, but why they work and who they help protect against, and what things in my life they help protect me against. So that also speaks a bit to the security education. I do think security education is very important. In my experience, the problem isn't related to motivation. Lots of people say they are concerned about security, and they seem like they really are, but they're trying to make these trade-off decisions for themselves in their lives, and they feel like they don't have the correct information that they need to do that. And that seems to be a lot of the problem that I'm running into. And that's why it may seem like people aren't making security decisions when they go and buy a television, but it's partially because they don't understand, okay, what does it mean? If Amazon has my TV viewing, what does that mean? What could they do with it? How would that harm me? They don't understand that. And usually there's actually good answers to that, but that's not part of what we're talking about when we teach people about security. And that is, I think, one of the challenges that at least my work is trying to address.
You know, I think you pointed out there's like the scope of the problem, information asymmetry, which is kind of which they're trying to talk about. Why would someone do this in general? What types of harms could befall me or everybody else with the cybersecurity incident, anything along those lines. And then there's like another level of when I buy this thing, what level of security am I getting? Or when I make this update or don't make this update, like the very transactional information asymmetry that happens a lot of times in the marketplace where they can't trade on something. They can't trade on it if they don't know about it. And it's interesting because I think if we think about the flow of information in general, you have security incidents, which is an adversary, an outsider coming in and taking information. But you also have privacy, which was mentioned before. That's the firm just selling stuff, right? That's a different thing altogether. That's not an outsider coming in. That's the company is saying, I think other people should have access to your data. I might get a little money on the side, but this is how we're going to have, I'm going to commit a privacy violation. We have a ton of trouble giving that information on the privacy side to consumers so they can say, I want to use an Apple device versus an Android device. Like we can't, it's really difficult. The companies have a hard time putting that level of detail in a digestible form to say, I want to compete on privacy. It's just a difficult thing to do right now. We really have that problem on security because I just think that the companies themselves don't always know where the security vulnerabilities are. It's hard to conceptualize and explain to people. And that's actually where Consumer Reports does a ton of work because when you have a marketplace with information asymmetries, branding and like putting a little sticker on that says Better Business Bureau consumer reports, those types of things is a signal from a trusted source. That's kind of a standard market solution to a major information asymmetry, not in the scope of the problem like you're talking about, which is more of cybersecurity professionals should just start making PSAs on, like if you see something, say something, do use two-factor authentication, update your password. They should just make those types of things. But this idea of if I can't figure it out myself, I looked for a trusted partner to put a stamp of approval and say the equivalent of Intel Inside, or this meets a minimum security threshold, and that takes the burden off of the consumer. And I'm not sure that the consumer can ever be expected to understand what factors are important. So think about what they would need to know. What factors are important, which Consumer Reports had a bunch of professionals trying to figure that out, and they had to just come up with ideas. What criteria is success, and does this product meet that criteria? That's a lot. You know what I mean? And so I almost think it's inherent to the problem that we're going to have information asymmetries, and we need to not put the responsibility on consumers to buy the right product, but look to companies to say, look, this is the minimum standard of security. This is best practices. This is just what we do. Or another one is Consumer Reports comes in or someone like that and says, this is the minimum standard. How did they do on those criteria? And that's the work that they do, I would say.
Yeah, so we're obviously trying to provide more information to the marketplace about the range of behaviors, but I do think, there is also a role for policy here to say what the actual minimum is, right? This is something that you talked about earlier, that consumers buy something, they kind of just expect it to work. They don't, it's like the analogy of you don't expect your fridge to explode, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same token, there are some reasonable expectations when you buy something. There's some implied warranty that is going to work, that's going to have some degree of support going forward. And so I know the Federal Trade Commission done a little bit of work on this area. They've done warning letters against, I know Revolve was a smart hub that was bought by Nest, and Google bought them, and it was kind of connected to everything in your house, and it relied on server support to work. And then one day, I guess Google's like, we have too many smart hubs, let's just shut this one down. But someone had paid $300 for it for 18 months before and just turned off, right? In that case, the Federal Trade Commission said, well, no. They sent them a warning letter saying, okay, because you're giving everyone their money back, we're closing this case. I think the implication being at some level that does become deceptive or unfair. And as we're in a space right now where there are absolutely zero norms around support length, right? At some point, I think the FTC may need to step in and say, okay, if this particular device is vulnerable to lots of attacks, consumers are being attacked. We see so many IoT products out there that have just dire support practices. Their FTC at some point is going to have to step in and use their Section 5 authority to say to at least put some barriers in the road about what's forbidden.
Well, most of the businesses, I think almost all the businesses now have a set of standards from a security perspective that they abide by, even within the products that they're developing. And there's, in fact, some of the jokes about standards, they're so great because there's so many to choose from. But that's the challenge of a business trying to set up its practice. Usability, as I said, is the bottom line, but oftentimes that is at a trade-off. They trade it off, and they trade off security for it, especially as a fledgling company, because they want to grab market share quickly as fast as possible. And I really think those are the danger zone people. An established company, I think, overall, there's a growth aspect that happens at some point. They get enough users behind them. They have enough of a reputation, they have enough of a brand name, and they embed security. If they haven't done it before, that's when they get serious about it. But it is a trade-off in the early days. Do you hire a new programmer to build more usability functions, or do you hire a security guy? They trade that off every single time as a young company. Most big companies, because they do have these standards that they have to abide by, are following the rules, for the large point, are following the rules and are doing the right thing and building security into their overall processes. That's not to say privacy, because I think, I don't know about you, but one of the great topics around the turkey table this year was how many people had ever read a complete privacy document, privacy statement on any service or product from beginning to end, on any product or any service they've ever bought. And the answer was nobody at the table had ever done it. In fact, most don't even get through the first page because it's just convoluted lawyer speak. It's more litigation prevention than it has anything to do with the declaration of their privacy. And so most people don't know what's in those documents, and they don't know what the data that they're giving to the company is for. It's very secure. They're sending it back to the host company very securely, and they're protecting it. But then what happens to it, nobody has any idea. So I think the overall perspective in the overall industry is run on a risk level, and they, more importantly than anything else, companies are trying to protect their brand and trying to protect their reputation to be able to stay in business.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. Currently, demand-side incentives for firms regarding security seem to be mostly backloaded, i.e. consumers leave due to a breach instead of being front-loaded. Consumers purchase based on security. Is it important to push front-loaded incentives, or are back-loaded incentives sufficient? And how would it be how would it be best to push front-loaded incentives for consumers?
I don't know, I'll take a shot first, I guess. From a front-loaded standpoint, having been in corporate America for quite a while now, I'm telling the salespeople to sell security as a feature doesn't go over really well. They want to talk about the usability, the functionality, the interoperability, the resiliency. They want to talk about every other feature. Security is in there. If you ever looked at a website for a product, if security is mentioned on that product at all, it's way at the bottom of the list. So it is back-end loaded. I think selling a product up front from a security perspective is an uphill battle today, and it goes back to some of the security training that we don't do to normal consumers, and infusing a security awareness in the general population that they should be asking those questions. So I think it is backloaded, and that's the way it's going to be until we can change business practices.
Well, one question is which market actor, I know the name of it is consumer demand, but I'll just say, I could see three, I used to say two, but now I'll say three different market actors that could exchange money for security, right? Consumers, which I think we've all identified issues with expecting security to be something that's traded in the marketplace of consumers. The other place that we look at businesses that have to get money is from stockholders, so public companies or investors, and they can demand, and that's why probably it's being, there's some policies around it through the SEC, is because if you're a publicly traded company, there are certain obligations of disclosure that you have to explain so that stockholders can understand the risk that you're taking around cybersecurity. And the other one, and that's front-loaded in some ways. Like you're saying, I need to prove to you to get your investment as to what, so you can invest in me if I meet some sort of minimum threshold that you've identified. And especially for institutional investors, they could look at that. And then finally, insurance companies. I mean, those are other market actors that you have to then front-load that decision to prove to them, and they will trade on security. So I know we're talking about consumers, but consumers are just, and you could have, there could be all sorts of market actors that actually are more likely to only do business with you if you meet a certain security threshold than consumers. So if you're target supplier now, I bet you they're going to be much more focused on the cybersecurity of their suppliers than they were prior. You know what I mean? Like, so I would just say there's more than consumers for market actors.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say, a couple of things. So one, some more requirements around transparency, right? So a couple states have laws saying that you have to have a privacy policy, but they don't actually have to say what's in them. So privacy policies tend to be like super vague, like, yeah, we collect data and do stuff. But if there's like if there's a requirement to say that you have to do, say X, Y, and Z in a policy, that allows maybe not the consumers sit around the table, but allows folks like us, allows folks like the FTC, allows the press to introduce some degree of accountability in there for practices. I do think it could be a good thing to push more companies to make affirmative promises of support going forward. We're starting to see some more of that around mobile phones, right? You've seen a number of Android devices promise to support periods for 2 or 3 years, and we have some more expectations that desktop systems are going to be supported for a longer period of time. We don't have norms in IoT. I think some policy mechanisms to get folks to say that out loud in advance, I think would help move the market in a good way. Companies committing to data minimization up front, I think the example with Apple Pay is a really good one. Apple going out of its way to say, hey, we're not getting this. And this actually is one of the more prominent selling features of Apple Pay. I mean, you don't often see a white paper linked to the main page on security protocols on the product description page, which I think is a really positive thing. And then, I think there needs to be just more questioning in advance. Do we really need to connect this to the internet? A friend of mine, bought a washing machine, and, she spent, and she's like an hour getting it to talk to the router, and she hasn't I can imagine some peripheral use cases. Yeah, if you want to start the cycle on the way home, so it's not going to get moldy, and so you don't have to start in the morning. So there's some mold minimization smell issues, but by and large, I personally would pay more money for a washing machine not connected to the internet, and so I think there's been this big Panglossy and let's connect it all in Silicon Valley and other manufacturers. I hope we're starting to rethink a little bit.
So my work is mostly on the use side more than the sales. So I think the premise of the question is that the security matters more during use than at the sales point, than the initial point. And I think that's right, but my work is mostly on use, so that could just be because I study use. But one thing that I've noticed, especially on the use side, is that that security matters differently for different types of products and different types of information. The contrast that I like to draw is when I talk to people about financial losses, such as stealing your credit card, people seem to believe that this is something that if someone steals my money, I can get it back. The banks are doing a pretty good job of giving my money back. However, something very different to compare that against would be photos of my kids. If someone steals and deletes the photos of my kids, there is no way that anyone can get that back to me. And so the people that I've talked to seem to treat those situations very differently. And so you may look at something and see security, but it depends on how the consumers are thinking about what is it protecting. And that actually might lead to slightly different answers in different segments.
But I would ask, that goes back to the question you asked earlier. Why? Why is someone going to try to steal pictures of my kids? So they're much more freer to put that data out on the cloud in their instance because they think, well, nobody's going to go after it, because why would they go after it?
Yes.
So, again, it goes back to harm and risk issues and that their own assessments of risk.
I would add, I think there's this other interesting challenge. I totally agree with what Rick said and with what Mike just said, that, these stories are a big part of how consumers inform their behavior. In essence, they're kind of doing threat modeling, but back to information asymmetries without a lot of information.
Yes.
And
Structure.
right, yeah, and structure and formal methodology, all these things. But ultimately, I think one of the challenges is always, what can I do about it? Because I think when you look at how do I prevent the loss of my photos, it's not immediately evident to every consumer every time what the right answer might be. And so I think one of the challenges is understanding what are the actions or steps I could take, even if I fully understand the threats and concerns. I think in that sense, front-loading this a bit would be super helpful in helping consumers understand that there was at least a purchase decision they could make. To Justin's point, I would also pay more for a new appliance that was not internet connected. I don't know if you've heard of Betteridge's law of headlines. Anything that ends with a question, the answer is no. I think that should be true of IoT generally. But that said, we don't have a choice necessarily. And so I think one of the interesting challenges is giving customers a constructive choice they can make, a sense that they can actually take an action.
Maybe we can follow up on that, given Rick's comment about how consumers treat different types of information differently. And so if there is a market or, different tools, security features available to consumers, what tools should apply in which instances? Take multi-factor authentication, for example, as a consumer feature. Should it be applied across the board, or in what instances do you protect information versus balance friction? anybody or Mike or Wiley, do you want to start?
Yeah, I might jump in. I would say one of the big challenges is always going to be making it work. It goes back to the usability trade-off, right? And actually what Justin said about, you could have the phone that doesn't connect to anything, not much of a phone. So we're always finding ways to trade off. And so, for instance, with two-factor authentication, one of the fundamental questions is it always going to work? I mean, there are actually situations where I would argue you should never use two-factor authentication because a loss of the second factor might lead to the complete loss of the data underlying it, like your photos, for example. So those kind of things need to be built into the way you consider it, and requiring it everywhere would be a pretty ill-advised policy in that sense. I think customers are also going to be challenged with things like interoperability. We can introduce the greatest security feature ever. If the entire industry doesn't use it or some critical number of players don't use it, it really doesn't matter. And so I think one of the interesting challenges remains how to provide widespread access to some of these kinds of things, particularly around authentication, which remains one of the thornier problems, I think, to solve in a way that helps consumers without putting too much friction in the process.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I won't even comment. I'll just let Wiley's statement go.
I would agree also. To repeat something I said, I'm not a product designer, but I study how people use a lot of these different products. And I think there's a role for giving people choices and for kind of designing different products differently. So I completely agree with you. There is also a role for providing appropriate information and for providing kind of nudges or defaults that are appropriate. So I really like the examples that Mike and Wiley were talking earlier about how like defaulting to locking your phone and having to take explicit actions to make it so that you don't have a PIN number on your phone. That seems like it makes sense. It gives people the flexibility, but it kind of defaults to be secure. And so I think having those kinds of expected best practices seem valuable, though while still providing some control to end users to make those trade-offs and security decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally skeptical about efforts to make privacy protections contingent upon sensitivity, but I think in the security space it definitely makes sense. Like, I don't want to have to get a 6-digit PIN to open my refrigerator. I think that would be like suboptimal, and I would not want to rate that highly. But yeah, I mean,
Fingerprint reader.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I was just thinking about another study that I did it was about software updates, but it actually says something interesting about defaults also. One of the things that's been interesting about looking at software updates over time is that we've automated the software updates more and more, so that if you go back 20 years, you pretty much had to click manually to go even look and find out if you had them and then do another click or two to install them. Now it's much more automated, and it's been a slow process over the years of getting more and more automated. And as we looked at this over the years, one of the things that we were noticing was we can't automate all updates. There's always a few that are kind of important enough that we can't automate that. And people who had more experience doing software updates were better able to make those security decisions. And that as we automated it more and removed it from the user, it seemed like almost that they had been learning less about software updates and were actually having more trouble. The way I like to
atrophied almost.
Yeah.
Your ability atrophied.
The way I like to think about it is if you have a range of problems from easy to hard, if you remove all the easy ones, the only ones left are the really hard ones, but you don't have the ability to learn from the easy ones. And that was actually an interesting, so there's a consumer education, so the product design is related to consumer education in really interesting ways.
Yeah, I'd like to echo the point I made earlier about security updates and the potential for being combined with updates that potentially impinge upon functionality, right? So EFF accused Epsom of putting in functionality to a security update that would make it harder to use third-party ink cartridges, right? And so that as and there's like similar practices, right? Facebook accused of using phone numbers provided for two-factor authentication for text spam or for targeting ads, right? And so how do you, policy, how does the FTC discourage companies from misusing information or permissions provided for security updates? I mean, I think, again, at some point this may exist, may violate existing law, but otherwise there may be some guidance the FTC can give to identify those sorts of things as bad practices.
So that is interesting because you could imagine a company that misuses the security updates and then uses it for a privacy violation, which is what you just described, as really undermining what we would call the institutional trust in security or online or information security in general.
Yep.
You know, and that would be, and because a lot of times security violations and privacy violations both hit my trust in a firm, but it also makes me distrust everything. And so we do studies that show institutional trust will go down significant percentage points after hearing stories about privacy violations or separately stories about security violations. And so you can, and public policy actually comes into play to preserve institutional trust on a fairly regular basis. I mean, that's one of the places where we don't let it up to firms. We don't let firms decide if you're going to allow insider trading or not. That we take that off the table and we say, no, we're telling you you can't because that undermines the institutional trust in banking. And so you could imagine the penalties for abusing a security update to be worse than just the standard privacy violation that you would have because of that institutional trust.
Totally agree.
It's interesting.
Thank you. Changing gears slightly, what types of security requirements have seen the greatest buy-in from consumers, which have seen the greatest amount of pushback, and why is this?
I mean, from our own experience, I would say the use of biometric authentication represents the greatest single success we've had in security, and has the greatest buy-in by far. I had talked about less than half of users setting passcodes. By the way, to use these features, you have to set a passcode. Like, that's sort of the carrot and stick we have, is it'll be easy, but you got to give us a passcode first. And we went to basically, I think recently, high 90s compliance with setting passcodes. So it was a pretty profound shift. And that's one of the greatest successes. But it comes back to also being associated with convenience, right? We can essentially put in place a security technology that removes friction, improves convenience. That's great. And the other one for us actually has been multi-factor authentication for our Apple ID accounts. We had tried doing this a fairly conventional way and found it didn't work very well. We've instead tried to make it as seamless as possible. And once again, we've found that by doing little nudges into it, like encouraging users to do it during the setup process, for example, we're getting much, much higher compliance. And the key is the cost has to be low for the compliance to be high. I think that's really the net we see in every case.
And I would add, probably the one that doesn't get noticed a lot is the sleep function on the phone. It saves battery, keeps your phone on forever. You can get to a charge station before you need to charge your phone again. But what it provides you is physical security. You have to have your password, you have to have your thumbprint in order to open the phone again. And so a lot of the old attacks of leaving the phone at the bar and someone picking it up and walking away with it and just being able to get into it have gone away because the phone is in sleep mode and can't be broken into. So there's a lot of inherent security. It goes back to the concept that security needs to be as transparent as, not as transparent as, but translucent as possible. It needs to be, users just can't see it. If they don't see the security happening, but you're providing them security, and a lot of big corporations do a very good job at providing that security for their product or service. If you're doing that, then the security is being used by a lot of users. If you're not doing that, you're making it intrusive into their daily operations. Something as simple as, yes, you have to multi-factor into things that you've never multi-factored into before. You have to enter a PIN for doing certain things. It becomes intrusive, and people will find a way or find another service that they don't need to use that service. So it's all about usability and functionality at the end of the day for the consumer, I believe.
So I like your example of the biometrics. Before that, I would say passwords were a really successful security technology. I don't know anyone who doesn't have at least one password.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a security technology that pretty much everyone uses.
I've got a 4-year-old granddaughter. I don't think she's got one yet.
She might, actually.
Probably knows somebody's passcode.
Yeah, that's true.
But another thing that to think about the translucency that's really interesting is one of the challenges that a lot of the security instances that I come up with is there seems to be a really big difference between taking positive actions and recognizing things that are present versus trying to notice when security is not there. So one of the really big challenges that a lot of security has had is if security is there and there's some kind of indicator that says, look, there's security here, but then sometimes that goes away. It's really, really difficult to notice when something's missing. And it requires a lot more expertise at understanding what's going on and why that might or might not be missing than it is to notice that something is present. And so it's a really big difference. And a lot of as we make security defaults, we're seeing this more where there's defaults to security, but then sometimes, like if someone turned off the PIN number on your phone and you didn't know it, how long would it take you to realize that? That's a hard question. And actually, I don't know the answer to that question. But so there's different types of security about presence versus absence that actually seems to make a big difference for people's ability to recognize and make decisions based on it.
Well, a good example of that would be the lock, the SSL lock.
The SSL lock, yes.
When it's not there and how many people go to websites now and you just expect that any kind of PCI transaction is in a secure session, and when it isn't, how many people really notice it isn't?
Yeah, there's been some research that
Our
says very few.
DLP tools and companies find it when it isn't.
Probably browsers made choices to really highlight that and to kind of really push people aggressively to using SSL. On the biometric side, I would point out that I think they have been fairly effective, and I'm a big fan of them when deployed correctly. But obviously, like biometrics are incredibly sensitive, and I think I think Apple and some of the other leading manufacturers have been very careful to make sure the data is stored locally on the device, potentially in a secure element. But I think you could run into problems if like a biometric database gets leaked, and then I think you run into this problem, some of the problems Kristen talked about, how you ruin it for everybody. But kind of more directly there, if people can access the raw files of people's fingerprints. So while I think biometrics can be very useful, I also want to caveat that with some concerns about yes, as long as it's done right. As far as ones that I think people have pushed back on, I might as well give a shout out to companies that make you change your password every 2 months. That's something that I know a lot of folks have found to be frustrating. I know when she was chief technologist here, Lori Craner wrote a good blog post about why this is actually bad security practice, and in addition to increasing compliance costs, can actually create more of a corpus of information if hacked that could actually make it easier to guess passwords. So that's something I know that a lot of consumers that we talk to like rebel against, and I think is probably, hopefully, is getting to the point where it's no longer recognized as an optimal security practice.
So actually, following up on that, what is the scope of third-party services such as password managers to handle some of the security burdens on consumers?
I mean, my own perspective is that there's a lot that they can do potentially. I mean, obviously we have our own password management features that we deliver, but we also have some really great password management apps that run on our platform. And in fact, we just recently did some work in our latest OS releases to help them integrate better with the system. But I'm sorry to say I don't think that market has proven very large. I think, I'm going back to sort of what's consumer demand for security looking like. Well, look at the market for VPN services, password managers, and products along those lines. And, it's there. There's clearly some interest, but it's not immense, and it's nowhere near the size of the market for 4K TVs, for example.
It's there, it's not immense, but I think they're both growing, right? I think they're probably adaptation to both. And then you look at something like ad blockers, which are another third-party tool, and the use of ad blockers is like getting is close to like 30%. Again, that's free, right? And so that's maybe one element as part of it. But I think there is growing market for privacy in general, and that does include third-party tools. Again, it's not all the solution, but I think the trend lines are positive.
One challenge with that is integration. So a lot of tools are difficult to integrate with. Apple's a great example in that they just recently, in one of the more recent versions of the operating system, allowed the third-party ad blockers to use some of the operating system features. And before that, they were a lot harder to use. There's still a lot of services out there that don't allow third-party integration, and that I think limits the abilities of third-party tools to solve that. And so that, in some ways, the lack of integration limits the market.
I think you're exactly right there. It's the, when you're dealing with consumer products, from that perspective, your product that you just developed, your third-party product that you just developed, has to work with an infinitesimal number of configurations and systems out there, from PCs to mobile devices to, to network devices. It's just, it's all of them, and you have to keep them. Hopefully, you have to maintain support for all of them. So you can't just sell a product out and say, okay, it's only going to work for this version of this, because your market's going to be that much reduced when you realize that there are people out there that are on, let's see, I think I heard the record was something around 32 versions old on an Android device. It's like crazy. And how can you build a consumer product that is sufficient from a security perspective on something that old?
I will add, just to put another little tone of maybe, I'll call it news, not bad news or good news. As a platform vendor, there's this interesting balance and trade-off we have to make, which is to provide entry points for people who build these kinds of third-party products like ad blockers and like password managers, while simultaneously not creating so much new surface area that we represent a great opportunity for attackers, which we're always concerned with. And so that's a tricky balance, and definitely one that we struggle with on an ongoing basis.
Okay, I'd like to use the balance of our time to shift gears and talk about tools that consumers have available to comparison shop and shop based on security. So Justin talked about this a little during the beginning with his presentation, but I'm curious to hear what other folks think. Is there a market for consumers to shop based on security?
I think consumers comparison shop everything. They do comparison shopping there all the time. Some of them, my relatives use CNET, use consumer reports all the time. I mean, I think there is a market for the ability to not only look at standard functions, usability features to it, but it's more important now as consumers are becoming better educated, and there is a small subset that are, as they become more educated on what privacy protections that particular product has. Again, in-house, I was looking at the Thanksgiving, and one of the questions I asked was how many people in the family were using some sort of Alexa-like product in their home that had bought the device to ease their use of some of the IoT devices they'd gone out and purchased. And the ones that were not using it were concerned for privacy issues. They had read the news articles about how it's always listening and they can't trust it yet, and all sorts of issues around security and privacy. Maybe that was my influence, hopefully. But the ones that weren't using it were looking at a function, or were using them from a function that they did their research and and they felt comfortable and they trusted the brands that they were buying. So I think overall there is a good market for those types of research, and the more the better.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just reiterate the points I made earlier about, I think there's more that can be done. I think that given that there's not a lot of affirmative requirements to make information available, to make products testable, and actually in some ways it's getting more difficult to test products in some ways. I know this was a conversation we had at one of the privacy cons that the FTC hosted a couple of years ago, that is sometimes it's actually getting more difficult for researchers to peek under the veil to see what's happening. And then beyond that, we're seeing some companies actually kind of going out of their way to affirmatively, actively frustrate testing. And so again, this is an area that potentially the FTC could bring some more actions on. I think the Volkswagen case was an example where the FTC did bring action that trying to fool regulators as far in terms of testing emissions in the lab, trying to look for the specific testing conditions. But it may need to go farther than that, because I think there the representations were based on statements to regulators that hey, we're compliant with X, Y, Z. We may need, and this is a comment I made at a previous hearing on artificial intelligence, but may need to expand the concept of deception to include tricking not just consumers, but tricking testers, tricking user agents, tricking a Safari browser, tricking other things that aren't quite exactly consumers, but are still as software and other things kind of intermediate more and more of the information we get. It may need to expand what we consider to be adding misinformation to the marketplace than is currently in the FTC tool set.
And so Justin just mentioned some challenges, and he also certainly mentioned some during his presentation. Update frequencies it might be sort of difficult to look under the hood. What do you guys think about those challenges? Are there others that he didn't mention?
Well, just on website use, I mean, there are commercial products available for companies to buy where you can see the number of and the types of places that your employees go to and rate those websites based upon the types of everything from its privacy rules to its contract use for how it should be used, the user agreement that you click on as you go onto those websites. To the security of the website itself. And those are available commercially, but they're largely not available for consumers. It'd be really great if some of those tools out there would be available for consumers so that just mere surfing could take on a brand new activity so that they could look at it and say that, yes, if you go to that site and you use that site for this following action, they fully understand what they're doing when they go to that site and the privacy that they're giving up when they're going to that site. So almost to me, those commercial companies that are doing it for commercial businesses should be doing it for consumers, but there just isn't a market yet for it. They can't figure out how to make a business plan that could sell this to consumers, but if they could, it would. I think it would be a great step in the right direction.
I would actually add that I do think transparency remains a struggle in determining these things, and vendors may be opaque for good reasons, like they want to simplify a message and make it easy for someone to understand, or for evil reasons. And it actually, Mike reminded me of this when I was thinking about, I actually have seen a consumer tool that's a plugin for the web browser that actually does a similar thing, and about 80% of the websites I visit, it marks as insufficient information to judge.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, if I have a second. One of the things that I've observed is people seem more willing to talk to each other, and there's a lot of word of mouth than I've seen in the past, and that seems to be increasing. So when I first started doing research with end users, I would hear worries about talking about security would make them seem like they were a tinfoil hat type of person. Now, I have no problems finding lots and lots of people who have heard multiple stories from other people about security issues, and they find them interesting, and they share them with their friends, and they talk a lot more. And so I think there are cultural changes going on about willingness to talk about security with other people that are really important. I mean, Mike just talked about having a security discussion with his family over Thanksgiving dinner, which seems like a very normal thing to happen now. And 20 years ago, I'm not sure that would have been seen as normal.
I think one small thing that would just be an issue in the future is we've come up with lots of solutions about the architecture and how it can solve security and usability problems, how we can have nudges to help people along, make it seamless to the user around security, how we can actually give better notice, and there's this effort to kind of explain to people why security is important, whether or not we disclose it to the SEC or to our investors or consumers or suppliers, and they're really good about it. I think the more work that's done in that area, the more it's hard to understand the answer around privacy, which is there's no way to explain this. It's too complicated. There's no solution that will ever be mutually beneficial. So that answer around the flow of information when there's an outsider versus when it's the actual firm selling the information or access to it it sounds disingenuous. They've tackled a harder problem in some ways. And so you could see the arguments of looking at those things and saying, if you solve this, now go solve that. Go solve privacy. Or if it's hitting institutional trust in this similar way, if we're regulating security minimums, you could see them turning around and saying, okay, now do privacy. So I think even though they are very different, they're different actors, they're related in a way that you could see them regulated in a similar way.
Though I totally agree with you, Kristen. The one thing I would notice, sometimes they are actually very much in opposition. And so a great example is that, laudable as PCI and its related requirements are, it actually requires Apple as a company to collect information on customer transactions that we'd actually rather not possess or not hold on to. And so I think there are cases where we see that well-intentioned security policies actually can be very much in tension with the what I think are the best outcomes for privacy for end users.
Well, thank you for those last comments that do very well in tying security with our hearing in February on privacy. But with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for their thoughts in this conversation surrounding this consumer demand for security. And I'm delighted to turn the time over to Jim, who will give closing remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Trilling, another attorney in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection here at the FTC. Just want to briefly, on behalf of the Federal Trade Commission, thank all of our panelists for the excellent discussion today, and also thank both our in-person audience and our online audience. We look forward to continuing the discussion tomorrow. The panelists today have highlighted a number of issues that we'll be discussing more in depth tomorrow. We'll be beginning at 9:30 back here at the Constitution Center with a panel on data security assessments. That'll be followed by a fireside chat between FTC Commissioner Rebecca Kelly-Slaughter and Joshua Corman, who, among other things, is a co-founder of the I Am the Cavalry security initiative. That'll be followed by a panel on the U.S. approach to data security, and we'll wrap up the day with a panel on FTC data security enforcement, and then closing remarks by Manisha Mithal, who leads the FTC's Division of Privacy and Identity Protection. With that, thank you again for coming, and we'll see you tomorrow.